Mastering posing for animation is one of the most important concepts to get if you're a struggling animator. And that's who this course is for. So this is the first week of a 12-week long course at animatorsjourney.com called the Intermediate course. It is the Swiss Army knife of animation courses that I think all junior to mid-level animators should have this knowledge about motion capture, cinematography, game animation, creature animation like quadruped animation and flying animation, writing your own tools in Python. All of this is in a single course, and that's called the Intermediate course. So what you're about to watch now is just the first week of that course. That's 12 weeks long, and you also get mentored by me so that we can create a demo reel shot that is impressive and worthy of applications that you're sending out to these companies. So I hope this class helps you along your animation journey, and hope to see you enrolled at animatorsjourney.com, wherever you are in your animation journey, as well as subscribe to this channel, because I think about 80% of you aren't subscribed who are watching this. So give me a like and a follow below, and let's get started with this masterclass. Thanks for watching. Posing. It is an essential part of being an animator is the ability to pose a character. We need to be able to take a rig and manipulate it in a certain way to achieve a certain pose. That is posing. To be able to do that, we need to have a certain understanding of our limitations and the appeal needed to achieve clarity in the overall pose and how it communicates all kinds of things: the emotional state, the force, the action, the personality of the character. All of these things can be conveyed in a single pose. We're starting with posing because that is the smallest unit of animation, one pose. Animation is just a collection of poses strung together and played back. That's animation. So it's essential, you can see, that we have to get a single pose right. If we can't get a single pose right, there's no way we can get a string of poses and a series of poses correct together if we can't just get one. So that's why we're starting here, so that we can get a single pose looking great. And then if we can repeat that action over time, over many frames, over many poses, and we combine that all together, then we'll have an appealing animation. But we have to start with the foundations of just getting that first pose in. And that's also how we typically start our animations anyways, pose to pose animation. So that's why we need to work on posing. We need to get that first pose down, because our animation will never look really better than those clean poses that we start with. That's how we're setting the foundation for animation. Those initial poses that we make for our animations are the scaffolding for our animation. And we need to start there so that our scaffolding is strong, and it'll make our job of animating much easier when we have a good understanding of good posing. So let's take a look at this presentation together so we can gain some skills and knowledge and ways to think about posing that aren't just theory and fluff and filler in the air. These are real practical things that we can implement physically into our poses. Let's take a look. So I use the term mastering poses lightly here. It just sounds better to say mastering poses. But the reality is it's an aspirational title, right? We're never going to master any of this stuff. And by maintaining a beginner mindset, it will always allow us to be open to new possibilities. So keep that in mind whenever I say stuff like mastering poses. It just sounds better. But this is the secret sauce to animation, learning how to pose, because that's where all the clarity and the force will originate from. And like I've said, if we string that together correctly, it will make a compelling and appealing animation. So why is posing important? We've touched on this a little bit. Your animation can never be better than your poses. So let's take a look at this example of Clark Kent and Superman, where the actor Christopher Reeves made specific choices in his posing to show that he could actually change his personality and his character simply by changing his posing. So that's how important posing is. You can actually morph from one character to another simply by adjusting your posing. No words are needed, no sound. Just by visually seeing him change his pose, he is communicating to us he's actually changing from one character to another. So that's how important posing is. So poses convey emotion as well as character traits or the type of character that person is, their personality, and their energy and their motion. So depending on whether we're having a static or dynamic pose, that can be communicated even just in a single pose. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So let's start with the first one, emotion. We can see the same character again. Miles Morales and Spider-Man are the same character, but let's look at him in two different scenes. The first is at the beginning of the film, and the second is towards the end. One has no confidence, and the other one has just, won the day and has a lot of confidence. Notice their overall posture. We can't see the eye darts and the eyes in the second one, but we can see that the eye direction is making direct eye contact where the first one is avoiding it. They're also shifting their head and they're closing down because they're insecure. So they're closing down their overall posture to show that insecurity. Whereas in the second example, they're wide. They're doing very wide, kind of dominating, confident postures to communicate their attitude and their personality in that moment. So that's how emotion can be conveyed in each of these examples. One is insecure and one's very confident. And we can see that without even hearing anything. Just by looking at the character, we can see that. The kind of character, right? We've talked about that in the emotional state change. One character can go from one emotion to another. But what about the character themselves, how they carry themselves? They can have internal changes and changes within themselves, but we can also see even bigger differences between different characters completely. So we have Gwen Stacy and Miles Morales. Miles is trying to act cool, and Gwen is actually really cool in this example. So Miles is trying to think of what's going to look cool and trying to act that in a certain way. And he's kind of stumbling and he knocks something over and he's gesturing. He's overcompensating for that insecurity, trying to act cool. So he's doing a lot more than maybe he needs to be doing. And then Gwen, on the other hand, is very simple, very straight, and very confident in their motion and in their posture. Whereas Miles is acting a bit erratic and trying to pretend like he has confidence when he doesn't. So those are two examples of different characters conveying their own personality within a few poses and a few postures. This was a really interesting example in the news recently that Usain Bolt actually filed a trademark to applied to have a trademark for his iconic victory pose. So even in the real world, we see people take ownership over their poses and posture in such a way because that pose identifies them and it is part of their personality. And so it's not just fantasy, make-believe in the films. This is real life, an example of that at play to show this character or this person. So energy, what's happening in the scene and what kind of energy that character has in that moment. Here's another example from Spider-Man, two different scenes of the same character running. The top one has a much different energy than the second one. The top one is very erratic. They're wide. They're kind of looking back, looking forward, and they're scared, basically, right? The kind of energy that they have. And then the second one is much more casual. Their strides are long and slow. They're kind of jogging. Their arms are by their side to hold down the prop, their backpack. And so they're a bit more contained and comfortable. And the top one, the energy is much more erratic and chaotic. And so even if we just freeze frame these, we would be able to see that in a kind of contained pose versus a much more wild pose to convey the type of energy that they have and even the state of mind that they're in. So that is also a contributing factor. So poses also tell the story. So poses can, in all of these examples, are telling a story and also part of the character. Maybe it's a very specific story moment, like the top left here in Psycho, or same thing with Terminator. We have, what is the emotional state of that character as they're dying, giving a simple thumbs up as they're going. It's a very iconic moment, and that's no sound, no words, and we can understand so much just from the pose. And then, and I just always try to work in Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs is one of my more favorite movies. But that has very clear posing. It's a very interesting stylistic choice of film as well, if you want to look at that for some research on very strong and deliberate posing. So this is, reaching up their hand, so our eye is ready to receive that burger. So our eye is already looking right at their hand, and we can see it relative to the camera that it's very large in screen. Their hand is almost as big as their entire body in the frame. And so even though that burger hits the frame in and is only there for a few frames, our eye is ready to receive that and see that because we're already looking at their hand because of how it's positioned in the frame, and it's helping tell the story of this person celebrating this moment. So posing is the driver of story that communicates what's happening. And none of these examples, again, we're not hearing anything. There's no dialogue. We don't need it to be explained to us. Just visually speaking, this is when you hear people talk about visual language and it sounds like some made up thing. This is what they're talking about. So how do we actually go about doing this? Okay, how do we create clear and strong poses? We can use some things to our advantage to make these decisions. How are we going to pose this out? We basically have to be the decision maker on how we're going to get there. And how do we do that? And this is another good example of simple posing. It's been turned into a meme. You can understand that character's thoughts just from their pose, from this movie scene, John Travolta. And it's used all the time for people to communicate without words how they're feeling. And it's very clear they're confused. What's going on? We don't know where we are or what's happening. And they can communicate that simply in a pose. And that's why memes have become so popular, because it's an easy way to share a lot of information. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, what's in the picture? It's someone posing. So a pose is worth 1,000 words, all right? And we can see that over and over again in all of these examples. So again, how are we going to get there? How do we get to this goal of having clear and strong poses? We're going to use reference. We're going to use our knowledge of anatomy. We're going to use the silhouette and line of action. And this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just some of the main points that we need to keep in mind. All right, so let's go through each one of these now. So for reference, even at Disney, they used real live action actors acting it out on video, and then they would use that as reference. We can see this from the Mad Hatter example here. And there's plenty of other examples, especially in the older films. You can actually find some of this reference and watch it back and see how that influenced the film. So we can use this as reference to pose our character, and we can even push it even further since we aren't bound by the physics of the real world in CG. We can actually go even further. Sometimes, stretching arms beyond where they can go and doing different things to push the pose to kind of check these other boxes about what we're going to use to allow us to create appealing poses that are clear and strong. And so, and even in paintings, right? Norman Rockwell, we can see he would actually shoot reference of what he was going to paint, and then he would push the poses even further. We can see, the distance from their two faces here. We can see in the painting, he actually leaned the police officer over even more to accentuate and exaggerate, right? Don't forget that animation principle that we know from taking the beginner course, exaggeration, all right? And we're going to talk more about that as we go. But that's all these animation principles we can start to think about in context with every new piece of information that we get, right? All of these things don't live in isolation. So when we're looking at this, we can identify, that's an example of exaggeration, right? So that's the reference. So on the right side, we actually have a model sheet. So if you work on a feature film or TV show, they'll also usually give you a model sheet, because even though we are working in CG, You can also get off of model. Now, model sheets were more typically used in 2D animation because you physically had to draw the limb every time. And so your drawing could be off, and it could be literally off model. The arm could be longer by accident. And so they would use model sheets to make sure they're staying on model. And you'll hear that staying on model even in 3D animation. And that's why they have model sheets here, so we can see the range of expressions, the range and the limitations that the art department, art directors, the director, they're all expecting to see in your animation. And you can use this as a guide to know, where can I work within? Because, this Tabitha is not Wile E. Coyote. They're not Roadrunner. They're not spinning their legs and doing very cartoony things. We can see by their model sheet that it's much more grounded in their posing and limited to their anatomy. All right. So reference is very important. And we've talked about reference in the beginner course as well. And we'll go through it again, but reference is even filming yourself most typically in an animation situation. But of course, if something's happening that we can't physically do, then you can go find that reference somewhere else, like, YouTube or other films, people actually performing that stuff. But you typically don't want to use someone else's animation as reference, because then that's like a copy of a copy. So the other thing we discussed was anatomy. We're going to go a little bit further into this, but there's certain things that our bodies can and can't do. And it's good to know that, because we want our posing and our animation to be authentic. While we can get cartoony and break things, if you do it too much, it calls attention to itself and it's distracting. So we want to use this knowledge in a smart way so that the viewer is focused on what we want them to focus on, which is the story and the character, and not distracted by us trying to impress that we know all these animation-y, smears and, breaking rules, and we can do all this flourishy animation stuff. That's a trap that you can get into as an intermediate animator. As you're beginning to learn all this stuff, then you just want to throw it all in. And we need to rein it in usually. And based on all of these things that we're talking about, how are we going to rein it in? Based on the reference, based on the anatomy, the limitations, and making deliberate choices as we go, so that we're not just trying to fit every animation principle in at every frame. All right, because it'll just be too much and distracting. So we'll talk about anatomy a little bit more, but in another lesson. But that's another way that we have, how are we going to get to this goal of a clear and strong pose? So the silhouette, our eyes register outlines and shapes, really contrast areas, right? If you look at the ET example here, you don't really see the rider until they get in front of the moon, so we can see their silhouette. This is another iconic image, like the Terminator thumbs up. And this is, not communicated in dialogue. It's not communicated in other ways. It's the pose, right? This was on I think on the poster, but it's the relationship between ET and the boy. And you can see that the magic of the moment, even in the pose. And so imagine any of these poses on screen, the forget what they're called from the Lord of the Rings, pulling their sword out. Imagine if we were, the camera was wrapped around to the right a little bit more. Their head was blocking where their sword was being held, and it was kind of like over here. That would not be very impressive. So the silhouette is the fact that we can see it away from their body and we can see the outline of the sword. Same thing with this amazing moment in Mitchell's vs. the Machines. The mom is going crazy and pulling the heart out of these robots. Imagine if we turned the camera to the left and the heart was, instead of it being to the side here, like you're seeing in the image, what if we turned her this way and the heart of the robot was blocking her head? It wouldn't read. It wouldn't be clear. Who we can't even see who that is, right? That thing they're holding is blocking their face. So we want to make sure that the silhouettes are strong, and that whenever we're posing them out, we're thinking in terms of silhouette as well as all these other things we're adding up. So clearly, I'm sure, depending on where you grew up and what kind of things you watch when you're growing up, you may or may not be able to tell each one of these silhouettes, but they're clearly distinct, right? We can see, I don't even know if I want to tell you. You should be able to know this. Maybe I'll have this question in the quiz, but these are iconic characters that you can tell who they are just from their silhouettes. And maybe, you're saying, well, these are character designs, right? These aren't their poses. All right, maybe you're being a bit contrarian right now. Totally get it. Totally valid. Well, then can you tell me who this is? Right? This isn't a character design. It's just a human being posing. You might have a couple guesses, but one of them probably is Spider-Man. These iconic poses, even in a non-super specific character design. This is just a silhouette of a human being, but they're posed in a specific way that communicates their personality and who they are. So silhouette is very important. All right. Line of action is the last one that was on that list, and it impacts the flow and focus of a pose. This is taken from a famous Preston Blair book that if you want some more reading, I think it's pretty short. It's a great book. But he has a great definition. An imaginary line extending through the main action of the figure is called the line of action. And plan your figure and its details to accentuate this line of action. By so doing, you strengthen the dramatic effect. The first thing to draw when constructing a figure is the line of action. And we'll talk about that a little bit with gesture drawing. But we can see these two examples. I love this because it shows the good and the bad. We can see how this is kind of muddied examples. And the line of action is not very clear here. You know, the tail is kind of confusing. It almost looks like another limb that's going to punch him in the knee, where here it's very clear what's happening. And when you're working on film or games or whatever it is, you don't have a ton of time for the audience to read stuff usually. Usually, you know, things are getting cut and, you know, back to back in different shots and a sequence of shots. And so it's only on the screen for a few frames, maybe even. And so you want the audience to be able to pick it up clearly. As soon as they see it, they'll be able to see what's happening. And they're not having to try to figure out what's going on. And that's why I say that this impacts the flow and focus of a pose. The line of action shows that clarity a bit more. What should we be focusing on? And here's just a couple more examples on the bottom. So here's a few more examples from that same book, and using Tom and Jerry as examples here. So you can see other things happening here too. Like you don't have to be super strict and be like, everything must be pointing in that direction. You can see the foot is kind of pointing out to the side. We're talking about the main overall arching line of action. And that goes back to the silhouette. The silhouette will help communicate that line of action as well. So we can kind of use these things in conjunction with each other to determine, is this still staying in the same, you know, idea that I have for the line of action? So even though, you know, this arm is over here, it's still kind of flowing through the body to the direction here that we're pointed at. So it's not like a super strict thing where you have to like line up everything on this one line. You know, take this Jerry's arm out to the side here. You know, there's still physically correct things. When we run, we have to throw one arm and then the other. So, you know, you will have to take into account the other body mechanic ideas that we need to physically move through a space or animate this character. One of those things to consider, not just in a pose, but in a series of poses, really in a two kind of main key poses, are reversals is one of those kind of animation concepts that are good to keep in mind when you're considering the context of the entire animation, not just a single pose. You know, where are you coming from and where are you going? And the reversal is a nice kind of tool to have in your tool belt to, if it can be applied. This is one of my favorite moments from a Toy Story movie. It's such a funny and entertaining moment. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's from Toy Story 3. And Woody is trying to escape here. And so we see a reversal, a C shape to a reverse C shape, or almost an S shape here. And you can see the GIF in the top left. But basically, there's an anticipation, a squash, and then we go into a stretch, right? Like these other animation principles can be applied to this same idea. Just because we're talking about line of action and reversals doesn't mean that's all that's happening. We can think of this also in the context of animation principles like squash and stretch. All right. And so we're having the squash and stretch moment, but also in context of the shape of the pose in a line of action, and that line of action reverses from beginning to end. And that creates contrast. When we talk about contrast, contrast is a very broad, overarching term that can be applied to a lot of different things like silhouette or, you know, reversals in this case. But it's a good way to, you know, keep in mind how the line of action isn't just conveyed in a single pose, but how does it relate to the poses around it? And if there's any opportunities to create contrast through that line of action changing, it basically a mirror image of itself in some way, right? Doesn't have to be particularly a mirror image. This is more of an S shape, depending on how you think about the legs conveying through this motion. And this even only happens for a second, but you can see the idea is continued through that kind of frenzied motion of him trying to hang on, even though this is just a still frame here on the right. So to summarize all those couple points that we made here, how do we go about this? We've learned about using reference. We've learned about using anatomy, which we're going to talk more about, silhouette, and line of action. These are the kinds of bullet points and questions you can ask yourself. Have I considered this? Have I considered this? Have I used this to inform my decision on how I'm posing this character? Am I just posing this character just guessing? Let's not guess. Let's use some things to help guide our decision-making so that our poses are informed and deliberate. All right. So here's a few more rules of thumb that are famous from the Disney Glenn Keane kind of style of teaching. So dynamic posing. It's another one of those words where you're like, what does that mean? Dynamic posing. So for me, dynamic posing is kind of an accumulation of all of these things, but specifically tilt, rhythm, and twist. And we can see that happening here in all these Arnold Schwarzenegger poses, all these kind of iconic bodybuilder poses. So tilt, rhythm, and twist also kind of sounds like some made up things. Like this is a song, like what's that Twist and Shout song? But tilt, rhythm, and twist have very specific meanings. Okay, let's go through each one of those. So tilt refers to the contrapposto kind of pose that we can see in the David statue. This is very typical of most weight shifts and how humans like to carry themselves, because we can lock our knee and we can put our weight onto our bones and not onto our muscles, so that we can stand and walk for a long period of time because of our ability to lock our knee and put weight on one leg. In so doing, it raises that hip. In so doing, that forces the spine to compensate. In so doing, that lowers the shoulder on the same side to create this kind of wedge shape between the hip and the shoulder relationship. This is super common. This is not just some animation-y, artsy thing. We physically, anatomically do this all the time. All right. And depending on your rig, I think on this one, these rules won't necessarily be true. But for the world axis sake, this is typically the Z axis. So if we take a look down here in the lower left, we can see that we have Y and X, and it's blue. Z is blue, so it's a little hard to see, but it's going right at camera. And so if we were to rotate along that axis, so we were to rotate this way, that's the axis that we're referring to. So in a world axis, if the character comes in default, according to the world axis, that's usually Z. So we're tilting this way or that with our hips and shoulders. All right, so that is tilt. That's the first one of tilt, rhythm, and twist. Next, we have rhythm. So it's a back and forth type of motion. Now, this can be about the overall pose. It can also be about the character design and how you're accentuating that design or not. There's also this concept of straights and curves, and that's kind of part of the rhythm that we talk about, we naturally have in our body. So, along the back, we have this rhythm of, we have basically a bump and a valley, a bump and a valley, and there's this rhythm, right? It's one after another, and we can see that visually in the pose. And that also exists kind of naturally in our bodies. If you think about your shin and your calf, there's a straight edge and a curved edge. And so there's this rhythm that happens through our body. When we go up through the leg from our calf and go into our thigh, then our leg gets straight again. When our quadricep comes out in the front, our back of our leg and our hamstring is flat, right? And then we get to our glute, and then our hip is flat. So our body has this natural rhythm to it that we can accentuate and consider when we're also posing. So this is typically X. So again, you can see the world axis kind of down here shows X is, again, based on this camera angle, it's going right at camera again. So anything that we rotate that way, forward and back, is going to be the rhythm idea. It's basic. Tilt, rhythm, and twist is just a way to think about the 3 different axes we have to use, X, Y, Z, right? There's only 3 ways we can rotate something. So then we have twist, which is the final axis, right? Well, we've covered Z, we've covered X, so now we have Y. So this is called kind of like the washcloth effect, if you think about wringing a washcloth. So this is opposing directions. To wring a washcloth, we can't rotate the washcloth in the same direction. We'll never get the water out. We have to have opposing directions and twist. That is the twisting motion. And that typically also happens naturally in our body. Right? If you think about a walk cycle, for us to ambulate our body, for us to locomate our body, our locomotion, if I can get these words out, is we naturally have to twist our body. For us to put our left foot forward, we have to put our right shoulder forward. So we have this opposing action, opposing directions naturally occurring in the body mechanics of our poses for us to be able to move around, okay, and stay balanced. So then that's typically in the y-axis. If you go straight down through my head, at least for the world axis, we can see right here is up and down as y. So if I twist this way, that's twist, right? I'm rotating around an axis that's vertical here. So here's a couple examples from the famous Glenn Keane, worked on Tarzan. He was a Disney animator, if you're not aware. He is a big proponent of tilt, rhythm, and twist. And when he worked on Tangled, he would do a lot of those notes of finding the tilt, rhythm, and twist and how you can push it even further. And Tarzan especially, I think, is a good example because him having a bit more of an animalistic kind of motion, it's much more exaggerated in him as he's moving through kind of in a different way. He's not walking on all twos. He's walking and using his hands a lot, and there's a lot more twisting involved there. So we can see just in these poses, if we isolate each axis and we think about each one, we can see the hips are opposing and twist with the shoulders. The shoulders are tilted and against the hips. And then he's slightly leaned over. So that's the rhythm we can see. Kind of see these, humps and valleys and humps and valleys and humps and valleys. Compare that to Jane in the movie. She also has tilt, rhythm, and twist, but it's very different. So tilt, rhythm, and twist isn't just something you crank up to 11, right? It's in context of the kind of character and the motion that they have. She's very proper, so her tilt, rhythm, and twist is going to be maybe slightly more reserved because that's the kind of character that she has, all right? So that's just one example of tilt, rhythm, and twist. So again, don't force it. Let it flow or let it go. In a shot like this, we can see where is our eye being directed. It's all posing, right? Everyone is pointing their guns in a certain direction. So our eyes are naturally drawn there. The lighting also helps, the contrast of dark and light. There's a lot of things going on there. But, one thing that intermediate animators tend to do and to watch out for is they tend to force stuff. They're like, I've just learned about this thing, so I'm going to crank it to 11 and I'm going to do it as most as I can so you can definitely see it. It's like, that's not the point. The point is to use these things in the context of what you are doing, because every shot is going to be different. Every character is going to be different. Every circumstance is going to be different. And so we need to apply these things in a very conscious and deliberate fashion. We don't want to just crank all this stuff up to 11 and it will be way out of bounds and it'll be off model and it'll look way too distracting. So don't force these things like we saw in the line of action where like a limb wouldn't necessarily be along the main line of action. Maybe it's there because, look, we got to have the correct body mechanics to be able to ambulate that character correctly according to body mechanics. So we need to take all these things into consideration when we're making decisions. And these are the kinds of things we can go through when we're asking ourselves these questions. Have I adjusted all 3 axes, right? We talked about tilt, rhythm, and twist. Those are basically just the 3 axes. It's a fancy way of saying, did you move all of those? How did you move them? Did you move them in relationship to the anatomy of that character and how we naturally move? Did I leave something at default? That's kind of a big no-no, right? When a character comes in a T pose or an A pose, you want to deliberately
go through each one and say, if I'm living at a default value, at whatever the bind pose of that character was, what it comes in as, am I doing that on purpose, or am I being a bit lazy? Am I not touching it because I'm kind of tired and I don't want to pose it out? That's not going to cut it. So we need to keep the character balanced. That's in terms of its center of gravity. We're going to talk about that here in a second. And we talked about forcing it too much. Hey, do I need to rein this in? I've put that stuff in, but was it too much? It's still there, but maybe I need to rein it in. Are you breaking any rules, right? Are you aware of rules that you're breaking? Are you doing so deliberately? If you are, it's okay to break rules, but you just don't want to be doing it by accident. So let's talk about balance and poses a little bit. That was one of the questions, like, are they balanced? So we have a couple things to consider, and these are a little bit of a repeat from the beginner course, but it's very important to keep in mind here as we go through posing especially. We have the center of gravity, center of pressure, and the base of support. Those are kind of the three main things we need to consider when we're posing out our characters. I like this example here because by the nature of all these poses, what they're communicating is the center of gravity and the center of pressure falls along the base of support of that staff hitting the ground. The base of support must be tiny because it's just simply a piece of stick touching the ground. But this character is able to keep their center of gravity and center of pressure over that base of support. So let's define those terms if you don't know what I'm referring to. So center of gravity is kind of this imaginary point where the mass is balanced and concentrated internally in a character. Typically, for a human, it's somewhere above their belly button. It's not necessarily at the waist, even though on a rig, the center of gravity or COG control is the waist. Sometimes that's called hips or the main mover or the main control. Sometimes it's called the COG control. Just because a control is named something like COG doesn't necessarily mean that's where the COG is in that character, because even in a character that can change depending on how we move our body because we're shifting weight. The COG is just a concentration of that mass. If our mass changes how it's posed out, that can shift the mass as well because our arms have mass. And so we're moving the center of gravity out away from our body if we move our mass away from our body. So the COG can change positions depending on the pose. But it's just kind of this imaginary point that exists and is a bit fluid because it depends on how you're distributing the mass of that character based on the pose. So the center of pressure is you just take that point and you go straight down to the ground, just what you call a plumb line. So if you were just hanging a string on the center of gravity, where would that string, maybe with some weight on it, where would that hit the ground? Where would that point onto the ground? That's the center of pressure. It's another imaginary point that we need to keep in mind. Then the base of support is this surface area underneath and between the contacts that we have with the ground, because that's what's going to keep us stable and upright. So the base of support must be underneath the center of pressure, the center of gravity, all right? And that's true for these kinds of static poses. We'll talk about dynamic poses a bit more. But especially in a pose like this character, this orange dot, we can't have the character leaned way over and their feet isn't underneath them. That they're going to fall over, right? So this is when we talk about balance and poses. We need to think about these three things, okay? So here's an example of base of support at play in the real world with a character who has very specific character traits. They're older, they have a cane, maybe they have some disability physically, so that's why they need a cane. And we can see that not only they're holding the cane, but they're holding onto a wall. They need extra support because they're going up a step. So how does all of these attributes, especially the base of support, come into play here? Well, we can think about the base of support as not just the foot, because right now we have the cane, he's holding the wall, and we have the foot. So his center of pressure can exist in anywhere in this yellow area, including his foot. I just didn't want to cover his foot up here. So that's where his base of support extends, and he's extending it out because he has this disability and he can't control his center of pressure and center of gravity as well as he would like to. If it starts to tip out of the way, he's old and he doesn't have the muscular strength to correct. So he needs to make sure his base of support is as wide as it possibly can be, and that's why he uses these other support systems to extend that base of support out. So now his center of pressure and center of gravity can travel a little bit and he still won't fall over. All right. And then compare that again to this. Now that we know these terms that we're describing, consider this example. This character has a base of support of just where this stick comes in contact with the ground. It's probably like the size of a nickel or a quarter. It's very small, a coin, right? Despite them moving all around, they're able to shift their weight in a way that their center of pressure is maintaining directly down to that base of support of just where that stick touches the ground. You can see how they're compensating for it. The stick moves to the side. As he goes to one side, the stick goes to the other, right? So we can maintain this balance down the center. It's a very cool shot. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but talk about balance and poses. Everything we've talked about is kind of these static moments. And as we get into more exaggerated motion, we need to take into context the forces at play that allow you to have your center of pressure and your center of gravity away from your base of support. We can see this, in context like this, we know that character is in motion. Otherwise, they're just kind of laying on the ground, or they would tip over even more. So we know that this character is moving probably very fast based on how far away their center of gravity is from their base of support. And it maybe it's so far over that they actually use their knee as part of their base of support as well. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. So, and then just one little thing to consider at the end here is posing games versus film. It just needs to be said that depending on the context of the type of project you're on, in games, a pose needs to work from all angles. A character can move the camera around, like in a third-person game, or even in first person. If you move around a non-playable character, that non-playable character that you're observing, all their poses need to work from all angles. If you're working in a film, it needs to work from the camera angle. And I use Hotel Transylvania's very deliberate choice here because they have very exaggerated, very stylized poses that only work from this one angle. If we were to slightly shift the camera around, that would look super wonky. But because they're playing the pose and the animation directly to a single camera, it's really just like a drawing. And that's another way you can think about these poses. If you're working in film or in 2D like Play Blast, it's really just at the end of the day a 2D image that you're exporting. And it's based specifically on the frame, how the camera is looking at that character. So we typically really tend to play towards the camera in these types of examples. When things are very, very exaggerated, they only work from the camera. But it's a good rule of thumb to try to make sure that I've been on films where even though we're only going to see it from a certain camera angle, you might have an animation supervisor say, show me another angle of this. This doesn't feel right. And they'll want to see your animation not from the renderable camera. They'll want to see it from a witness or an independent camera that you'll create, and then look at your animation from a totally different perspective. So depending on the show, the picture, the movie that you're working on, you might have someone who, even though this might be true, it must work from a single angle, they may still ask to see it from a slightly different angle because maybe they can't put their articulate what's going on. So they want to see it from another angle so they can see there's something going on here. I can't really see what's going on yet. So you might have to still make sure that your animation works from other angles. So those are just some things to consider. So take a breath, let that all soak in because it's a lot of information, and you may need to revisit this or take notes and have a little, checklist, not just to, check this stuff off as you're posing, but question yourself. Learning animation is really about learning decision making, and you have to be deliberate and conscious and creative through all these decision making processes of being an animator. And these are the types of questions and the attributes that we'll go through mentally to think, okay, am I being deliberate here? Have I covered this? Have I considered my animation and my pose from this perspective of silhouette? What about line of action? What about contrast? So these are all just helping to inform and build your toolbox of being an animator. So thanks for watching this lesson. I'll see you in the next one. Anatomy. It is important to know some basic principles about anatomy while we're posing out, because those are going to be our limitations and the range of motion of a typical person that we should take into consideration when we're posing. When someone says that's off model, even though we're dealing with 3D models that are already built, you can go off model because you can break something. Basically, you could move a joint in a direction it's not meant to be moved, and that's what we're going to learn about in this lesson. So let's take a deeper look. So let's start from the ground up, and we'll go body part by body part and discover where there's limitations and rules of thumb that we need to remember. And basically, this will be universal. This isn't just my own body, but stuff you'll want to remember for every kind of body that you animate. So first rule of thumb, your knees follow the direction of your toes. All right, and let's watch an example of that. There is some motion I can get if I twist my body, but there's a point at which I cannot twist anymore until my foot actually turns in line with the direction of my knees. So let's watch that again. You can see I'm twisting super hard here, but I can't twist anymore. And if you watch this foot right here on the screen right, you can see it's trying to peel off and it wants to turn this way because it's being twisted so much. And this knee is pointing in a different direction than my foot. And it's only able to do that because I'm putting a lot of pressure on it. This is not a neutral thing. So the asterisk that the knee doesn't always follow the foot is only under the circumstance of extreme pressure, that you're really twisting it. This is how people hurt their knees when they're skiing because of the ski gets stuck in the snow and your knee does the twisting and nothing else twists. So if you want a torn meniscus, a torn ACL, this is how you do it. And we don't want to have that in our animation because that looks unnatural, looks painful. And so the natural rhythm of our body is that our knee follows the direction that our toe is pointing. So you can see on this left leg, the knee is pointing in the same direction. You know, if I could point right at camera, the knee's pointing right at the camera, just like the foot is pointing right at the camera. Now, when I twist, you can see that there's a point at which I cannot twist anymore. So I'm going to twist. I can't twist anymore until that foot turns out. Then that knee can continue to go. And now these are pointing in the same way. And that's the natural way they want to be. Otherwise, we're putting way too much torque and pressure on our knee. And that's how you have knee injuries. All right. And so that is a super important rule of thumb because when we're animating, the pole vector can just be floating there. And a lot of beginner animation students never even touch the pole vector. They think the rig is going to take care of it. The rig is not going to take care of it. Okay. And so you always want to be conscious of what direction your knee is pointing, because that is going to be a very noticeable problem if you do not animate the pole vector of the knee correctly, because we want our knees to be in line with the direction of our toes. So again, you can see there's a little bit of play there. There's a little bit of wiggle room, but it's only if I'm really torquing it. I'm not just going to be able to do that and just relaxed standing there. My knees will never not be pointing in the direction of my toes. They'll always be pointing in the direction of my toes if I'm just neutral and casual. The only time that they might is if I'm putting a lot of torque on them. And even then, it's only a small amount that the knee can go outside of that range, all right? So we can kind of see here, there's this range. There's a very limited range. You know, this knee's slightly pointing this way while the foot is still pointing this way. It's only about a, maybe 15-degree range there that the knee can actually change before you're going to tear something in your knee. And you can see there's a point at which, and unless my foot turns out here, which it does, then I can keep turning my knee. All right, so that's rule number one. The knees point in the same direction of your toes. So rule of thumb number two, while we're down here in the feet and the knees and the ankle, is that the heels are gonna lift off of the floor if you go down low enough in your center of gravity. Let's watch at what point does that happen. And what we're gonna be watching for is this relationship of the foot to the shin bone, because this angle right here, there will reach a limit where I can't go like this, right? I can't have my shin bone be right here and my ankle bone be here. The ankles don't move that much, okay? And so there will be a point at which this shin bone cannot rotate down any further until this heel comes up, because they will have found a relationship, maybe it's something like this. And by lifting the heel and pivoting off the ball of the foot here, they will maintain this exact same angle through that lift. But it will reach some limit here that we can see in the reference. So let's keep watching. So I'm going to get low, low, and so now you can see what is this angle? My heels start lifting. So it's going to be an angle like this. And the lower I go, that angle is staying the same, right? You don't see this angle changing at all. That angle isn't going here, it's not going here, it's not going there. It's staying the exact same angle from the time that the heel lifted off the ground until now. It's still the same angle, because that's the extreme. That's the most I can go, okay? So when you're doing jumps, when you're squatting down, when you're landing, all of these things, you want to take that into account. You can see I repeatedly hit that limit. I hit the limit, I hit the limit, my heel has to come off the ground. Now, the other thing to take into account is right now I'm only going up and down on the spot. Well, what if I'm jumping forward? I'm putting my center of gravity in front of my feet so that I can have forward momentum. And that's going to slightly adjust this heel rise. It's going to still happen, but you want to be able to see the difference between me going straight down and me going forward. So I'm going to jump forward here in a second. So I'm jumping straight up and down, and then I'm going to jump forward. All right. So you can tell the difference how much sooner that my heels come off the ground when I'm jumping forward. So here is me jumping up and down. They barely come off the ground. And when I land, there's a bit of a softness there, right? Because I'm not actually going down that low. So if I was to go down lower, my heels would come off the ground. But when I go down about the same amount, but I'm jumping forward, well, I do come down quite a bit lower. But if I jump forward, you can see I'm coming forward with my weight is already, my center of gravity is probably over here somewhere. So I'm already kind of at the edge of my base of support. So I'm about to tip over if I don't push off. So that's where a forward jump might be slightly different. But the rule of thumb is your heel will come off of the ground because there is a maximum amount that your ankle can bend in that direction. So let's move up the body to the spine. This is a very extreme pose, but it demonstrates something I want you to know and take notice of. This is a contortionist. Even in a contortionist body, the torso does not move or bend very much because we have all of these ribs coming out here. So they're kind of like the scaffolding that keeps this from being able to bend. And most of the bending occurs in our lower back and in our neck, okay? But in the midsection here, you can see this is pretty darn straight. In an super extreme position, in a super extreme example of someone who's incredibly, incredibly flexible, even in that example, this portion of our torso is going to stay fairly stiff. And now that is typically mirrored in the rig. There's not typically a lot of controls here around the sternum, right? There's going to be one for the chest. And that's not because the rigger got lazy. That's because they're following anatomy. And if they do have too many controls there, don't use them, okay? Unless you're doing something super cartoony, that's not how we move. That's not how our body and our anatomy moves. Even in the most extreme circumstances, it doesn't move that way, okay? So keep an eye on that on your spine when you're also twisting and you're bending in a extension or flexion kind of motion. So the last rules are going to be around the shoulder, and I want to impress this upon you because it's not something that really sunk into me and was never really taught to me until much later I realized this. The shoulder only connects right here. The shoulder is a floating joint, okay? look right here. See this gap right here? There's nothing connecting the shoulder to the body except this joint called the sternoclavicular joint. That is the only thing that's connecting the shoulder. So what does that mean for us as animators? That means we need to incorporate the shoulder a lot more than we usually do. And this is something beginners totally forget. They raise the arm and they don't raise the shoulder. That is a huge no-no and a huge telling sign that this is a beginner animator because they don't understand how clavicles work. This is the clavicle joint. That's how the shoulder is connected to the body. We can see this in this anatomy model here. If we take a look, you can see there's actually nothing connecting this scapula to the rib cage. This is a floating joint. It's totally floating, and muscles are what keep it bound to the body. The thoracic joint here is what this is called. But there is no joint, right? It's just like a big space here. This is filled with bursa and muscles. The real joint where this occurs is right here on the sternum, okay? Or right at the top of the sternum. This is the clavicle here, the clavicle bone. So keep that in mind as we're raising our shoulders. Where that is actually pivoting from is right here. When I do this, I'm not translating this joint over here. It's actually rotating from that single joint. So let's take a look at some reference and see how and why that's important. So watch me raise my arm. I can only raise my arm so high until the clavicle also needs to be involved. Now I'll raise my arm here and I'll only raise it as high as I can without using the clavicle. That's just me shoulder shrugging. So I'm going to raise my arm here and I can't raise it any higher without my shoulder getting involved, without my clavicle getting involved, right? There's a limit to how high you can rotate just this arm before the shoulder has to also be involved. Now there's some rigs that have that auto kind of included where it will, if you're rotating the shoulder, it will also start to include the clavicle, but that is very rare. And I don't prefer that because I want to have control over it. Now here you can see that scapula joint sliding because it's just a floating joint. You can see how that's only how high that I can lift this arm without getting the shoulder involved. I cannot put my arm up in this position without having my shoulder or my clavicle rotate up as well. So now I can get into that motion. Now I can get into that range of motion. So do not rotate your shoulder from here and not include the clavicle, all right? You've got to get that in there. And that's a telltale sign of a beginner who doesn't do that. And we'll take a look at the rig here in a second. So the other way that we want to look is from the side, because what we've looked at so far is just in this motion. Now the same is true when we're reaching forward or we're pulling back, okay? Let's take a look at some reference. Here's me reaching forward without using my clavicles. I can only reach so far forward. Now, when we talk about pushing poses, this is what we're talking about. How far, what are the limitations our body can go to push it as far as it can in poses? Because that's the natural state. If we're reaching for our life, for a rope or a lifeline or whatever it is in the animation, in the motion of what we're trying to do, we cannot restrict our arm motion without using the clavicle. We need to push that pose and have that person really posed out, trying to grab that thing, right? And so now look how much further I can reach forward when I include my clavicle, and you can see how much more that rounds out my back here. Whereas before it was very kind of angular, and by including the clavicles here, I can reach so much further. And same thing pulling back, right? If I'm pulling back and I want to push that pose, what does push the pose mean? It means knowing the anatomy limitations that we can reach to make it feel believable that this thing is actually occurring. I'm really reaching for this thing. I'm really pulling this thing. And the shoulders are a huge component of that is usually completely ignored by beginners. And so we want to avoid that at all costs, okay? So that's super important. Now, before we wrap up this lesson, I want to look at the rig and just really press this upon you. So you can see, you know, a rig typically comes in a T pose, and so it's already kind of at its limit. We can't do this, right? This is what you do not want to do. Do not do this. You cannot do this. Okay, what you have to do once you get to this height is you have to start including the clavicle here. And typically these joints are somewhere around about where that sternoclavicle joint is located, which is here on us. So that is how we get our arms to a higher point. Now, once we do include that, then maybe we can adjust this slightly to get this even higher and kind of go back and forth. And maybe there's some limitations on the rig itself. You know, maybe there's weighting issues where things start to get smushed in here, and then we can start to cheat that. But what we can't do, right? We cannot do this. This is bad. This is good, okay? You can see how the two are totally different and how one looks broken and one isn't. And so that's how knowing anatomy will help inform our decisions on how we're posing this. Now, while we're on the shoulder, I want to discuss one other thing, especially while we're in FK forward kinematics, right? This is forward kinematics when I'm rotating like this, right? We should know that by now. So if I want to pose out something with the hand outstretched here, we have to know how our body works, okay? We cannot rotate our arm in without our shoulder internally or externally rotating. That's what brings our arm in. We cannot pivot from the elbow here. Our elbow only goes in this direction, right? This is happening because we have two bones here called the radius and ulna, all right? And we can see those on the anatomy model here. If we look down, we have two bones here, and that's what allows us to rotate from the wrist. That's not happening from the elbow joint. The elbow joint only goes in one direction. To get into a pose where we are kind of down and having our hand out, how do we do that? So first, anatomically speaking, we would need to rotate our arm down. Then we know, as we just discussed, our elbow can only move in this direction. I don't care that this gives you every option here. We only want to move on this axis. That is anatomically correct and how we should be starting all our poses so that we're not starting with cheating. We're not doing something like this, right? Where we're just throwing the arm around. That is not right, okay? The elbow moves in one direction. It moves in this direction. If we want to move this in or out, that happens at the shoulder. That happens up here, okay? Internally, externally rotating the shoulder. And that's how we have to do it in our rig as well. Because that, as we're doing in-betweens, right? If I'm going from here to here, I want that rotation from this keyframe, right? From this keyframe to this keyframe, I want this motion to look natural and accurate. And that rotation is occurring up here. It's not occurring at the elbow, right? And these are the kinds of things you have to think about, not just in your posing, but when you're animating, because you want to set up your animation for success, even in these single poses, okay? Because you have to think about it this anatomically and how you want the motion to occur. So again, as we're getting into this pose, so where we've come from is we've only rotated on this axis, right? Only on this axis. So now we're anatomically correct here. And then we know we want to rotate the twist in the forearm. So this is the one that would take that twist, okay? And then we can see by internally or externally rotating the shoulder, we can move this arm around. And that's how the arm moves, right? We cannot do this. This is bad. This does not happen. This is how our arm moves, internally and externally rotating from the shoulder joint. Because again, the elbow can only move in one direction. All right. Now, the asterisk there is once you get that in and you're at like the very final stage of polish and whatever, and if you need to tweak things slightly like this or like that, that's okay. But when you're creating the foundation for your animation, you do not want to start off cheating stuff from the very moment you start, because you're going to create problems for yourself in your animation. Once you start that in between and everything looks loosey-goosey and weird and doesn't look natural, that's why. All right. And so that's why in our posing, we need to have a fair understanding of anatomy. So when we're posing our character accurately and in the way that we would expect things to move in real life. From there, we can exaggerate things and we can go, push stuff a little bit more. But we got to start with that knowledge. That's going to really inform how we pose things out. So those are the rules of thumb that I want you to keep in mind as you're working on your challenge this week in posing your character. All right, I just wanted to interrupt quickly and see how it's going. Leave me a comment below, give me a thumbs up, let me know if you're resonating with this material, and also to remind you that this is just 1 week of a 12-week long course. So if you want to get more information like this, as well as be mentored directly by me, check out animatorsjourney.com and look at the intermediate course, which this material is from. Let's talk about dynamic posing, or posing that is in relationship to action taking place. Up until now, we've talked about a base of support, the center of gravity, the center of pressure needing to be over the base of support. Just to recap that, this would be her base of support, right? Her foot. That would necessarily mean for her to stay upright and stay balanced, she would have to have her center of pressure right over that point, right over that base of support, right? That center of pressure where the center of gravity meets the ground and meets this base of support. But that's a static pose, right? She's not moving from side to side. She's not traveling through space. What happens when we travel through space? What kind of things can occur to the pose? Let's take a look. So here's an image of Barry Sanders. He was a famous football player, running back for the Detroit Lions back in the day. And you can see this very exaggerated pose here. And you can see just how off balance he appears, because we would guess that his center of gravity is maybe over here. And where is his base of support? It's all the way to screen right. So how does this make sense when we draw a plumb line from the center of gravity, like we've learned how to do, and draw it straight to the ground? There is no base of support on this center of pressure point here on the ground. Where we draw the COG here, this line going straight down should fall on a base of support, but there's nothing there. It's just the ground. So how is he staying upright? He's staying upright because he's in motion, and there are a combination of forces that are allowing him to stay upright. If he doesn't continue to move, he's going to fall over. If he was just in a static pose, he'd fall over. But because he's moving, he has the opportunity to stay upright. So let's see Barry Sanders actually in motion here. So he's going to juke here, right there, and then go a different direction. Now, if we freeze frame, we get a very similar image to what we just saw, where he's incredibly off balance here. But we know that there's a combination of forces now that are allowing him to stay upright for the time being. So what are those forces? Those are forces we already know, his momentum and gravity. So the combination, the net combination of these forces almost create a centripetal force. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. But essentially, because his momentum was traveling this way and gravity is pulling him down this way, there's a net force in this direction. So according to his body's momentum, effectively gravity is under his foot here because of the force of his momentum was going in that direction. And he can place his feet ahead of himself, ahead of that force, to push back on that force and change direction. Now, if he had very slippery shoes on, or he didn't have cleats on, or it was raining outside, he would not be able to do this because we need friction here. And so that's another force at play. Friction allows him to change direction and temporarily appear very off balance because there's no base of support under his center of gravity, where the center of pressure meets the ground. Now, I mentioned centripetal force. Centripetal force is what keeps this cup from spilling. Because the cup is in motion, it is being pulled in the direction of the force, of the momentum of the weight of that. So that's why none of this is going to spill out. And you can actually see where they can swing it around their head and it's not going to move because of centripetal force. There's a constant force in the direction it's trying to go. If we were to cut this string right here that they're holding it by, it would just continue in this direction. But because this force is pulling it here towards the center, it is creating this basically a fake force. In physics, a centripetal force is just a term for net forces, right? And we have the momentum of this thing constantly moving. It keeps wanting to go this way, then this way, then this way, then this way. But the string is pulling it in towards the center, and that's that centripetal force. And that's the combination of these factors of gravity, of the momentum of the mass, and it being connected to this system. Now, in our body, like we saw with Barry Sanders, that system is our foot pushing off the ground here. So we can temporarily get off balance and change directions based on our body mass moving in a certain direction. Now, the same thing occurs when you're driving a motorcycle. I've never driven one, but if you were, that's the same thing that would happen. You know, if we look at maybe where the center of gravity is on here, based on the silhouette and the distribution of mass, it's maybe here, maybe even lower because the bike is so heavy. So maybe it's down lower. So, but there's no, the base of support is just these little 2 tire marks. And if we go straight down, again, we're off balance here. We're off balance because they're in a turn. Now, if they're trying to go straight and they all of a sudden jerk to one side, they would have to continue turning or they would fall over. Now, again, if they didn't have friction to help them, their tires were slippery or the ground was slippery, they would just slide out from under themselves and keep going in the direction that they're trying to push against here. But that is another reason we can see that in play here as well. And because friction isn't 100%, you can actually see them sliding here. So they're sliding because of friction isn't at 100%, and they are working against their own momentum when they were traveling in a straight direction this way, and then they met a turn. So now they're trying to turn this way. So they're trying to convert this vector, this momentum going in this direction to eventually go in the opposite direction. So they have to apply this friction, and they'll get that centripetal force so that they can lean over to apply more friction and direct the direction of travel for their motorcycle. Now, in a more stylized example here, we have a pose, a single pose, but we can tell Batman is running here. And we can tell just obviously by the pose, but the fact that he's off balance is okay because he's in motion. Even though it's a still pose, we can see that he's in motion and he was traveling maybe this way or right towards camera, and now he's trying to turn this way. So he has to get his foot out in front of where that force was trying to go from his previous direction of travel and redirect that motion into a new direction. And that's why we can get our foot over here basically where the momentum was headed. We need to get our foot or the tire of a motorcycle out in front of it to redirect that motion through friction with the ground. And that's what allows us to be temporarily appearing to be off balance, right? If we look down here. But again, remember back to that centripetal force of a cup being swung around. That's basically what's happening here. Let's take another look at another pose. Now, this doesn't really have to do with centripetal force, but it shows another example of how we can temporarily be off balance because we are in motion. This baseball player is going to place this foot on the ground over here somewhere, right? And so it can start leaning in that direction and he'll catch himself with this foot as it swings down. So temporarily, we can set ourselves off balance so that we can move in the direction that we're off balance in. And that's essentially how we locomote. That's how we walk. That's how we run. To initiate those things, we have to create an imbalance in our pose to shift our weight so that we can begin moving. And this can be exaggerated in many more examples like this as well. Hopefully that helps clarify why some poses can be balanced and appear off balanced. It's because they're in motion and we're getting a little still frame of that moment of them being in motion. And those net forces allow that person or the vehicle to be temporarily appearing to be off balance. And we've learned about centripetal force, which is essentially kind of a fake force. It's a term used to describe the net forces of all these things of gravity, friction, and our own momentum, aka velocity which implies that we were moving, right? Remember the difference between inertia and momentum. I'm not saying inertia. Inertia is if you're just static, you're still. Momentum implies velocity, that there's some motion there. And so those net forces are what creates this opportunity to appear off balance. So just to put a fine point on this, when you're doing the pose-to-pose method in your own animations, you can have a character to appear off balance because you are anticipating the fact that once you begin animating and splining and doing the other steps of the process of animation, that there's going to be motion there that's going to help support those poses. So that's why it's good to use reference, and that's why it's good to have these concepts in mind to help inform your decision-making on how you're posing your character. Thanks for watching this lesson. I look forward to seeing you apply these concepts. Gesture drawing is a great way to stay sharp in terms of your skills of observation, and you don't have to be a great drawer or draftsman to do this. Now, if you were to attend a traditional art school, you would probably take a class that's about life drawing. Life drawing is slightly different than gesture drawing. Life drawing is when you go into a classroom and there's a live model in the room with you, and they're either nude or semi-nude, and you spend 5 minutes to 30 minutes drawing a single pose. Now, with gesture drawing, it's much more loose and free and very quick. You could do a gesture drawing in a few seconds. And so that allows us to quickly isolate what we're observing and get that motion, that gesture into the simplest forms possible so that we're training our eyes and ability of observation to observe the most simple representation of what we're observing so that we can translate that into our own poses in our animation. This is the foundation of looking at reference and being able to interpret that reference into poses that you have to recreate. So this is kind of the starting point in the sense that we don't need Maya. We don't need a 3D program. This is us using our ability and our skills of observing to simplify what we're seeing. And there's a few tricks that we can use, and it can be very rough. So don't think that you have to be great at drawing to be able to do this. These drawings are not about, amazing, beautiful drawings. These are about clarity in a gesture, in a pose, okay? And you can do that with just a few simple lines. And I'm gonna show you how you can isolate that and basically have a process with what we're gonna look for and then represent that as quickly as we can. Now, how this translates to animation is we are going to have to do this over and over and over, and that's going to be part of the challenge this week, is performing these drawings. We're not going to be doing, animation. We're all about poses this week. And gesture drawing is the foundation for that, of how we begin to interpret what we're observing, because, when we're looking at reference, it's usually going to be a 2D image, like a movie or something. We don't necessarily see things from all angles, which is maybe what we're going to have to do in 3D. Or maybe we see a 2D image and we actually have to represent it from a different angle. So we need to understand relationships from a 2D image and be able to interpret it into a 3-dimensional pose inside the software. So we need to start with that 2-dimensional representation and interpretation of what we're observing in a gesture drawing. So let's get started and I'll show you how it works. Now for this exercise, I'm going to be using Epic Pen, which is a free download that allows you to draw on your screen. And I'm going to be using a program called Pure Ref. And that's also a free program where you can basically drag and drop in reference, and I hit Control F to frame up to full screen the whole thing. And I also turned on what's on by default is always on top, because I want to be able to draw on this screen and I don't want the reference to keep hiding my drawings. So I can have these drawings up and the reference photos next to them at the same time. So that's my setup. And you can do this on pencil or paper. I'm doing this because I have a tablet that I can use and it's easier to teach. But what may be easier for you when you do this for your challenge is to do this with pencil and paper. And that's what you'd be doing if you were in a traditional art school anyways, is using kind of newspaper quality paper in a life drawing class, and you'd be, using pencil for that. So this is just for demonstration purposes, but you could even use Post-it notes. Like, you don't have to get fancy and go to an art store or something. So this is the main thing to get out of this, is our ability to observe what we're seeing and interpret that as quick as possible into these relationships in the body. And then, this also helps us see how we can start to push things, because we're simplifying it into its basic elements. And then that gives us a few things that we can, push and pull in different ways to try to push the pose. All right. And exaggerate the pose. Remember, exaggeration is one of those animation principles, because we're exaggerating and caricaturing reality a lot of time in our animation. So let's get started with these poses. I have static poses on the top, and I have dynamic, unbalanced, in motion poses on the bottom. So this is going to be similar to what I want to see in your challenge this week, to pick one of each category here. I think you might do 2 of each. So, and I'm going to provide those to you, the images, that is. So I'm going to zoom in here with my mouse wheel, and I'm going to kind of isolate one image at a time. And just pull this over so that we can isolate each image and go through what gesture drawing is all about and how this really is useful to animators. So when we first observe a pose, the main things we've talked about is center of gravity. We have these kinds of concepts already at the top of our mind. Center of gravity, base of support, all those types of things. Now, when we're looking at a whole pose together, we also have line of action. So that's one of the first things we can also look at. And the line of action, I would say, for this guy is basically, kind of through here. So something like that might be the line of action, how, his body, look how his spine bends up that way, up through his head, and that's kind of supported through the base of his foot here. So just very quickly and that's where I'm kind of already seeing the motion of this pose go, how the weight's distributed between his 2 feet. This just tells me some basic things when I draw the line of action. So that gives me the overall kind of look. And then the 2 main things we're going to look at are the relationships with the hips and the shoulders, and how the twist and bend and tilt, all those things that we've talked about already, how those work with just the shoulders and just the hips. Forget about everything else and just think about, what are the hips doing? They have 2 hips and they have 2 shoulders. What are those doing? What does that look like? That looks like the contrapposto pose that we've talked about, right? Where we have the line going this way and the line going that way. So there it is again, popping up in our first pose. We can see the spine kind of goes like that way in the line of action, but really just in these first couple of elements that we can look at, the line of action, the hips and the shoulders, we can already get a really good sense of what this pose is like. And then we can just add in the details as we need. Now, I'm drawing over the picture, which is not something you would be doing. I'm just doing that to demonstrate it as it exists inside the reference image. Gesture drawing, you could do this on the subway or in the park. You're observing someone sitting or doing something. You could do a quick gesture drawing of them. It's not like you have to have the picture and you're drawing over picture tracing stuff. Well, what the big thing here is we're interpreting it. So we don't want to be tracing over it. So what I'm going to do is basically go through what I've already described, but not by tracing. So I'm basically going to get kind of the line of action of what I'm seeing, and then the representation of the hips are kind of this way. And I'm going to represent these basically as a box and kind of orbs, circles for the shoulders. So we can kind of see the spines going this way, and this shoulder is lower than this one. And then we can start to add these other elements, right? We can add the head, we can add the feet as they exist, relative to where the body is. And let me just slow down for a second and say, if you're in a life drawing class, or if you've watched a movie and there's someone life drawing and they're doing this kind of a thing, and they're like looking at their reference and they're, trying to figure stuff out. That's actually a real thing that you can do to figure out proportions, right? So when we're looking at a pose, we can figure out, okay, relative to something else, where is this in relationship to that? So for example, in that sense, we could say, and how this works is basically, if I'm holding my thumb up I could see, okay, from like the bottom of his crotch, basically, how far down is the floor. And this is to get proportions, which is less gesture drawing. Gesture drawing is a bit more loose, but I just wanted to throw this in there if you're more curious about life drawing. And you've seen people do this kind of stuff. It's not a fake thing. I could basically hold my thumb out, pick something on my thumb, either my nail or like to the first joint, and say, okay, I've taken one measurement. That's the same as essentially the top of his shoulder to the bottom of his crotch. That distance is kind of the same. So proportionally, I want to draw whatever I do here, and which I've already established, is, you know, this line here, or at the bottom of his crotch maybe be down here. So I know that the floor, if I'm going to draw his feet now, they have to be about the same distance down here as that. So I can draw that distance again down here, say, okay, his foot is somewhere on this line, as opposed to taking a wild guess and their feet end up like down here somewhere or up here. And then you're drawing the knee all weird, and then the whole drawing gets way off. So again, this is more of a life drawing tactic, but just wanted to show you a little tip of, and you can also use your pencil. So why I held up my pencil first is you can pick different points. You know, if I hold that to the side, you can pick a different point. You know, a pencil has natural little markers on it. And, you know, this is my tablet pen, but, you know, I could pick this and use that as the measuring tool, or hold my thumb and leave my thumb there and then measure different parts of the body and say, okay, because, you know, there are things, the proportions of our body doesn't change, but they do relative to how we're posed, right? So in this case, his elbow is up, but, you know, my elbow is this, or my forearm is this long, but his elbow is poking out. So the forearm is what's called foreshortened because it's coming right at our view. And so even though the forearm didn't shrink in size relative to our view, it's being foreshortened. And so that's why we can take measurements relative to other things and kind of figure out, okay, how do these things work? The other things that we can measure are negative space, not just, you know, everything we've looked at so far is the positive space, basically. You know, the silhouette, you know, which we've talked about a lot in previously, is figuring out what the silhouette is. Well, what about the negative space? Let's figure out what is this representation too. Let's figure out the whole package here. What's the negative space between here and here? So it's not just about the positive space, but it's the negative space. So we can start to stack all of these things so that we can get a very quick representation in our mind's eye, an interpretation of proportions and the relationship of different body parts to each other so that the pose is more accurate. And as quickly as we can get it done, because gesture drawing isn't about, even though I'm taking a long time to explain it because I'm teaching it, when you're doing it, it should be very, very quick. And as I go through these, I'll try to be a bit quicker, but obviously as I have to explain it, I have to slow down. And even this may be too fast to some of your liking, but so, you know, basically I'm just kind of eyeballing this stuff. And then for feet and hands, those are complicated. You can just do simple shapes, and then you can start to pick where the knee is and start to use, you know, circles for that as well. So, you know, the knee's here, and I'm looking relative to the hip. Where's the knee? Is this knee on the inside of that hip or the outside? It's on the outside. So and I'm kind of doing this all visually, you can also do this drawing and say, okay, well, I'm going to place the knee over here, right? And then we just start drawing lines of stuff and start connecting the dots. And we can get a pretty quick representation of what the foot is doing here. Or sorry, as I'm drawing the foot, I'm saying that. What the body's doing. All right, and we can draw these, but it's very simple. You don't have to get very complicated, and this drawing doesn't have to be great. This is all about just getting the overall forms down here and just being as quick as you can to kind of get the sense of what the pose is. So this is his hand, and this is his, you know, shoulder. So essentially we have like, you know, maybe not a great, and we can't see this other arm. I'm assuming it's kind of like down here somewhere. And even then, you know, the proportions are off. So we could take this and refine it and do it again and say, okay, well, what I messed up was probably the proportions. because I erased that line that we were using, or we're just saying the proportions overall relative to the size of his head. Even his head is way too big for this body, so the proportions get out of whack. But essentially, what we're doing, if I just do that really quick again, get the spine, get the hips, and we're just trying to go as quickly as possible, and figure out what the pose is and what the spirit of that pose. So maybe something like that. So that's, the arm down here, the foot here, and same here. That'd be down here somewhere, but just super loose. It doesn't have to be perfect. And that just gives you a sense of like, what am I looking at? What represents this pose? Because when you get into trying to recreate this in 3D, you're going to have to go through this anyways. So having a shorthand way to kind of visualize it is going to be helpful. So that's one. So we got the line of action. We had a quick pose. Let's just do another static pose real quick. Pull this over and take a quick stab at this. So same thing. I'm looking at some kind of a line of action here. This is down here. And then get the relationship of the hips. So it looks like this hip is higher than the other. So, you might have to get, you could get a little fancy with this and have like a 3-dimensional box. So we have something like this, so that we can see that this hip is higher. And then the shoulders, we have like a very close relationship here. And these are out like that. So we have one big one there, and then we have squash and stretch. So we have squash on one side and we have stretch on the other. Here's the stretch, here's the squash in a single pose. And then we can, just work out what's the relationship here with the arm and the knee, and work that out as quickly as we can. And just draw straight lines for that one. Draw this one out. This shoulder is maybe a little bit lower because we can see, if I drew a horizontal line straight across, we can see this hand is actually quite a bit lower. So I want to make sure I keep that represented there. And then we can draw the head, and there we just get like a quick representation, right? So again, very loose, doesn't have to be great. And I'm not good at drawing, right? I've been working as an animator for years, and I have never had to show a drawing to a supervisor. So don't think someone's going to come and like inspect your gesture drawing or expect you to even really do gesture drawing unless you're on, some specific 3D show that has like 2D elements. So this is the motion one. So we can see that we're way far out on compared to our base of support here. And this needs to be even further back. And then the shoulders are kind of stacked here, one on top of the other. And the shoulders are basically foreshortened because we have this twist happening, and the same thing is happening in the hips. And that might be further up there. And then this leg is coming out. So we've got the foot coming out, and then the knee here. And we can start to, build that pose to be more than the quick gestures that we're doing if we want, but that's essentially it. And get the twist there. And of course we could start to use if things get a little messy, start to refine this as we go. So just looking at the representation of like that hip, I want to make it clear that this one's in front. And we have this basically twist that's happening where we're going this way on the top and, this way on the bottom. So we have this kind of washcloth effect that we've already talked about. And then, the arm's doing whatever it needs to be doing. And then the head is kind of sticking out relative to its chest here. So we can have the head kind of more forward, right? And then the arm's getting really thrown back. So it's back here somewhere. But this is just quick stuff, right? And it's, again, less about the drawing and more about your ability to observe what is happening. What's the, tilt, rhythm, and twist of these poses, relative to the center of gravity, relative to these kinds of landmarks that we've looked at in regard to the hips and the shoulders. So just real quick, big shoulders, but there's a twist in the hips. So to camera, we're looking straight on to the shoulders, but the hips are twisted. So I want to try to represent that here by having those kind of twisted out. So we represent that and have this leg in the front, big knee coming forward there. Boom, boom. And then the more you do this, the more kind of shorthand and quicker you'll get with it. It's been a while, honestly, since I've had to even really do this. But for someone starting out, it's very helpful to get, a sense, even like referring back to the line of action, I can see the relationship is already messed up, right? I want the head further out here. The head should be further out here. So relative to these, these should be not so stacked on top of each other like this. So what I could do is just get rid of this real quick. That. And that's where the line of action can help kind of simplify things as quickly as possible to make sure you're kind of staying on track with where things are. So that helps me identify maybe where I need to push things more than what my eye's even seeing, and where my eye might be kind of lying to me a little bit. So got that. Again, I'm not trying to impress anybody with my drawing. I just want to understand what's happening in the pose and the relationship here. So that's where the goal is for these. So if you're, submitting drawings for the challenge or something, don't get paranoid that, they're not good enough or something. Where's the knee relative to this leg? It's right here. So that can be pulled in. And then we have this going this way, and the foot's here. And that's basically it. So you can see how, even as I've been doing, I feel like I've gotten better just in these couple of ones. So if you want to do more than what is in this week's challenge, definitely go for it. But it's basically a shorthand way of figuring out what we're doing. And, animation is just doing this over and over and over, because we're not creating a sculpture, we're creating motion. And, if we were creating sculpture, you'd only have to do this once and create one perfect pose that's going to live for eternity in marble. We're trying to create motion. So we have to do this repeatedly over and over and over. And that's why we need a shorthand to work as quickly as we can, because we need to do this through time, right? Through motion and through time. And that's why, you can be quick and snappy with this stuff and get the general essence of the pose and the motion at each frame as we go through a blocking pass, for example. And then you just start to refine that and push it as you go off your reference. But we'll get into more of that process, obviously, as we go along. But I wanted to show you kind of a more traditional way to approach observing and kind of sharpening your skills of observation. And that way is gesture drawing. So hopefully this is another little tool in your toolkit to kind of simplify what you're seeing and kind of testing to make sure your eyes aren't lying to you and you're really observing and having these kind of shorthand tools, which we covered were line of action, the relationship of the hips to the shoulders, and then using proportion and the relationship of other body parts to make sure that everything is where it needs to be in relationship to other parts of the body. So hopefully that's been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson and your gesture drawings for this week. Pushing poses. Pushing poses means exaggerating what we see in the reference or what we've generated in our own mind from the poses we've created on the rig. Pushing poses means we can accentuate what's already there. And really, this is the art form part of animation where we can put in our own kind of perspective on a pose and exaggerate it just a tiny bit. So let's take a look at some reference, and then we're going to jump in and we're going to create a pose from scratch. So this lesson is going to kind of double up as your demo for the week. So I'm going to pose something from scratch from a T-pose with our rig. And then I'm also going to then take a moment to push that pose beyond what we see in the reference to be even more appealing in regards to the type of rig that we have and how far we want to go, how far we want to exaggerate the pose that we see in the reference. So let's take a look. So before we jump into Maya, I just wanted to show one quick example looking at just photographic reference and think about the kind of levers we can pull when we are going to push our poses. All of the terms and things that we've learned so far are those levers that we can push and pull, like line of action, squash and stretch, and all of the animation principles at our disposal. So here you can see an example where we have a reference image and you can see how it's pushed. So compare the line of action, the blue line here, with how far this is pushed in this direction, right? So it's exaggerating that motion, that line of action up through this foot here in this kind of draw over pose. So we have even more arc, another animation principle, arcs, line of action, pushing the squash and the stretch. So this is the stretch side, this is the squash side here, and really pushing that so we don't break the rig, but we just make what that pose is about even more so about that thing, whether it's anticipating a swinging of an axe or an attitude or emotion. That's what pushing a pose is all about. So let's jump into Maya and take a pass at creating a pose from scratch. So we have our character in a T-pose. All I've done is reference in the rig, which you would be able to, should know by now how to do. And then I want to grab the reference and bring it in and just show you a handy little script that I've made as well. So we have a plane here, and I'm just using a plane in case you wanted to have multiple images up on a screen. They're a little easier to manage and move around, I think, than using the image plane, which you can get to from view image plane and import image plane. This way you can just have multiple ones. I like to just throw them on planes, and that's just how I like to work. But if you want to use an image plane, that's good as well. So I like to use surface shader. So I'm going to go to assign new material by holding down right click, dragging and saying assign new material. And I'm going to choose surface shader, which should be under your Maya favorites here. And I use surface shader because it has no reflection or glossiness to it. It's going to be exactly what we put in for the image. So I'm going to jump over to the surface shader tab here. This is under the attribute editor. You can hit Control A as the shortcut to toggle that on and off, or just hit the tab over here. And for out color, I'm going to click the checkerboard here. So that is the out color that we're going to change. You can just slide this stuff around and see, oh, okay, that's what the color is. So we could click on that color swatch and change it to something totally different as well. But we want to put a texture in here. So I'm going to click that little checkerboard button, and then we're going to click File because we want to add a texture file, an image file to this. So I'm going to click that. And so then we have the file node, which is file 1 right here because it has to name it something. So it says file 1 so that if you add more, it can say file 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then we just need to add the image name here. And the easiest way to do that is through browsing in your folder browser. So I'm just going to browse to where that image is now. So when I find my image and I click open, you can see it's applied it, but the plane that we brought in is a square plane. And I'm going to give you a handy dandy script that is going to find the dimensions of the image and then resize the plane to be exactly the same dimensions as the image. Because you can see it's kind of stretched out in this direction. If I hit R and then scale out, you can see it's kind of scaled in that direction, and we would want to kind of get it to the right proportion so we're not guessing. I created this little resize script. So with that plane selected, if you just click this button, which is going to be below this video, so you can bring it in the script editor. So you can either open it as a file or copy paste it in. So I just hit the little button in the bottom right down here. That's a script editor. This is just super quick. And then this was from me actually making it in this tab. But basically, you can file open the script and then run it, or you can create a new tab. Right click here, new Python tab, and then you can just paste it right here and then select everything. I've already got it in this one, so I'm just going to select everything and then hit play. So because I have the button already created, I'm just going to use that. So I'm going to click that and it's going to resize how I want. Hit E and then J I'm going to hold down J as I'm rotating so it snaps. Then I can move that to the side and create a ground plane for my character just so we have something to kind of work off of to relate to what the ground is. And then we can move the reference plane up into position so we don't lose the feet. And we can even scale it down to the size of the person if we wanted, whatever meets your fancy, but not super important. And then I'm going to turn off select geometry so that I don't accidentally select the floor or this reference. Now I'm going to get to the front camera view by holding down spacebar and then left clicking on the Maya here in the center and dragging down to front view. And when I start posing, I like to work from the most influence I can have over a character first and then work outward. And that naturally is the center of gravity control. So I can select the center of gravity control and have the most influence over how I'm going to adjust this character. So to get the most real estate space on my screen, I'm going to turn on the channel box instead of having the attribute editor up. And I'm also going to minimize the outliner so I have the most room to work with. You could also close down a bunch of other things, but that's just how I want to get the most real estate to work on for the viewport. So I'm going to start looking at what the center of gravity is doing. So because his knees are bent, I know his center of gravity must be lower than default. So I can go ahead and drag him down, and then I can move him maybe slightly to the left. It looks like if I look between his feet and then draw straight up, it looks like he's actually shifted slightly to the left. So I can go slightly to the left, and then I'm going to start dragging the feet out to kind of get the most out of the pose, or like, the most influence over the least amount of kind of movements, because we're trying to be efficient here. So like, what are the least amount of things I can move to have the most influence here? And then when we get into the hips and the spine, you want to make sure you're not just kind of randomly moving stuff, and you want to make sure that what you're rotating is what you're going to be using throughout your entire animation. That's really important, especially for new students when we get into spine and hips, because some people will start rotating from the center of gravity, and then later they're rotating from this, and then they start splining in the graph header and they can't make sense of why their whole animation is fighting itself. So just be consistent on what you choose to use. In this case, I'm just going to use this hip control here and see if that can get me part of the way there. And then I can use this base to adjust the root of the spine and then rotate the spine back. And I'm thinking in planes, right? So I'm taking one plane at a time, meaning I'm twist, tilt, and rhythm, right? Remember that concept. So I'm tilting, and then I'm going to twist in the way that I think he is, and then maybe in the rhythm, go backwards. So I'm kind of taking each one of those axes and thinking about what those relationships are. Same thing with the hips. Remember, we are trying to have this relationship between where the hips are in relationship to the shoulders. And we could jump into 3D to make sure that we're doing that as well. But I just want to see how far I can get just in this front view very quickly. So I'm going to rotate this shoulder up because I know I want this elbow to be poking out. And as we know, that the forearm can only bend in one direction. So I want to make sure that I'm doing that deliberately in FK when I'm doing this, and just rotating this up. Alternatively, you could use IK, but because the rig came in as FK, I'm just going to do that for now. So then I'm going to adjust the head and the neck. So you can kind of see how I'm working my way up the body. And I'm using the head and neck together because they tend to work in tandem with each other. And then sometimes you want to go just one at a time. So this is the head. So I'm trying to get the orientation of the head down. And so I'm just kind of like going back and forth. Now, the other thing about this shoulder is I didn't mess with the clavicle yet. And that's a big no-no, right? We want to incorporate the clavicle so that we're not messing with too much of the anatomy to be unnatural there. And then this wrist is pretty dramatically posed out. So I want to make sure I'm going as far as I can with that. And I'm going to hit this thing in the head so I know where the head's at. Sometimes in a view, it's hard to see where something is. So I'm just going to go as far as I know. All right, I'm hitting it. So now I can just dial it back a little bit. We can double check our work when we get back into 3D. But that's just kind of a quick way to do it. Drop the clavicle down a little bit, drop this down. So gravity's kind of taking over. And, this is up to your own interpretation, maybe what he's doing with his arm. I want to make it kind of dramatic like that. Maybe have his wrist kind of hanging a bit more naturally. When we hang our arms, our hands tend to rotate inward. So that's why I'm rotating these inward slightly. And then we can just kind of take a look and see how that's going. Now, the weights on this hip are maybe a bit wonky. I'm still working on this controller, on this rig a little bit. So I'm actually going to redo the hips by using this and see if that makes a difference. I don't think it does. So I'm going to undo that and go back. But I'm going to try to take another pass maybe at the weighting by the time you get this. But so what I want to see now is in 3 dimensions what's happening, because you can see this arm is not working. We want gravity to be taking over. He's very relaxed, so we want this arm to be straight down. So we're just thinking in terms of like forces, gravity, what muscles are tense and what aren't. What I don't like is the line of action that I've got versus what the reference shows. So if we go back to the front view, you can see I'm very up and down here. We can almost draw straight up in line, and this flows through this leg. So I want to get this bent over even more so that we have a bit more of a line of action through this leg up the spine. And then we can maybe shove him over slightly and maybe down more to compensate for how much we tilted the spine. And then what else can we do? I'm kind of like starting to slow down to make sure I'm not missing anything. And I think it's mainly the hip and the spine that I want to make sure I'm not missing. It looks like he's kind of anterior, I think it's called anterior, tilting his pelvis. So I want to make sure that's out. And then we want to also compensate maybe in this forward lean a little bit on these, and then have this rhythm come back a little bit so that there's a bit more exaggeration on that front one. So that is kind of a quick and dirty example of how you could pose a character out. It's not perfect, but let's take a look at now pushing this pose a little bit. So if I wanted to exaggerate this, I can look at the silhouette, I can look at the line of action, I can look at the hips and the shoulders, everything that we've discussed so far, and see where can I push it? It's already going in this direction. Can I go even further in that direction? Or can I go, less in one and more in the other so there's more contrast? Think in these terms. Now, before I push the pose, what I want to do is set a keyframe so I can compare where I started with where it's pushed. All right, so I'm going to just select everything in the scene, all the controls, and hit S. And then I'm going to jump forward just 1 frame, and then I'm going to start working on this push pose so then I can see what kind of progress am I making. Am I going the right direction? Am I not? So this is something you can do when you're playing with poses in your own animation to test things out so you're not kind of going off the deep end and then you've lost your work. So always use the timeline as kind of like a workspace so you can push your poses and not lose your work. All right, so let's begin by pushing the pose a little bit. I'm going to lean into this idea of this hip over here a bit more and even further down. So I'm just basically doing more of what's already there. And I'm going to rotate this over even more and then see if I can't get a bit more kind of arc into the spine here. I may even translate the chest a little bit, because what I'm looking at is this edge of the silhouette here. And so what I could do is pull this over. In FK, you kind of want to avoid translating the spine much, but you can get away with it from time to time. And what I'm looking at is this kind of silhouette, and maybe we can get that going up through the arm as well. So maybe we, slightly shift, the shoulder up. Again, a slight no-no by translating. But what I'm looking at here is this kind of silhouette where we have this big stretch pose here, and then we have kind of the squash happening over here. Now, maybe I can push this shoulder back a little bit and I need to not forget this penetration here with the head. So I'm going to pull that forearm back and grab this, maybe even more of what it was doing, and then exaggerate the head so maybe it's even further back. I don't want to lose the eyes though, because I think that's kind of important to see the character to kind of identify with them. So I don't want to lose the eyes totally, but I want to get a bit more. Yeah, I think this is it. But you know, when we think about the line of action, this big arc kind of going through the body, and maybe I went too far this way, so we can maybe pull that back, or maybe we can push this foot. Let's see, we can push this foot out maybe, so that we kind of have this flow through the body. Seeing where, and you know, some of this is just playing and seeing what, like, if you don't know, like, don't just sit there and think and then just think in your mind, move stuff, keep moving, you know? And that's where you can find that in that playfulness, like, is this what I want? At least you're finding, you know, answers no to that question, right? So if you don't know what the yes is, at least find what the no is. So, okay, I know I don't want that, or yes, I do want this. So I think I like a little bit of that knee, and I want this one to be maybe even more straight. So we have a bit more of a kind of this triangle pose, and like one kind of bent and one kind of extended. And maybe we actually do something with this arm. So we have kind of like a flow through the arms too, so that these arms kind of connect in like the direction that they're going. So I'm trying to think how, and to me, this is the fun part of animation, because we're getting to play a little bit and have some creativity here. So I'm kind of just like totally ignoring the reference to a degree, and just seeing like, let me play with this thing a little bit. What if they put their hand on their hip or something like that? And maybe that's what's happening in the reference. We just can't see it. So, and this would probably be easier in IK, but just because I'm trying to just move with what I got as quickly as I can, I'm just leaving it in FK for now. And then if we want to turn on the hands, we can do that down here. So I just select that one, and then we can turn on the finger visibility here. So we could go and refine that. I'm not going to do that right now just for time's sake, for demonstration purposes, but you could go in and do that. So, you know, I think we've pushed this pretty well. You know, it's maybe a bit exaggerated. I'm translating the wrong one. I want to make sure I'm translating the right control at the right time. And it could be refined a little bit more, but I think that's a good demonstration of like taking the reference, how much further can we go? And then you compare, where was I with where I am now, right? And and maybe I went too far with this. I think maybe dial this one back. And that's the kind of back and forth you're going to have as you mess with it. You know, you'll end up finding, where are the limits on, like, is this too pushed? I would much rather go too pushed than not pushed enough. So I think it's I don't want these hips to feel too disconnected so I want this to kind of all work together. So that's why I was kind of dialing that back. And then maybe we can go further with this one now that that's, those hips are back in there. And maybe it's the translation. Anyway, I'm going to start noodling this too much for demonstration purposes. But this basically shows you how you would go about, okay, let me see how far I can push it, and then compare with where we were, with where we are. And then that can kind of influence the direction of like, how exaggerated do I want this to be based off the reference I'm looking at? Is this going too far off the walls? Am I pushing it in the right way? Is it too broad? Is it not, is it not broad enough? Is it too subtle? And these are all the kind of playful questions you can do when you have this kind of workspace mentality in the timeline. And, worst case scenario, I jump back here and I start over. I'm like, you know what, let me get back to like baseline from the reference, and then I can start pushing again in another direction. I could, grab everything and middle mouse drag to 16, meaning I basically copied everything to 16 as long as I hit S for setting a key. And now we have a baseline here again. So now I could try another version, right? Maybe leave the foot there this time and so the feet aren't so far apart, and go here, little stuff like that, so that, again, we're not losing the work. Now we have multiple versions to compare it to.
so that we have choices. So when we're in this kind of discovery phase of pushing something, we can see, all right, let me have like a really broad version and a subtle version. And then what you can do is actually blend between the keyframes, right? So like if I like these two and I'm like, oh, I want 50% of this one and 50% of that one. Well, all I have to do is select all the keyframes here and then just shift click to move this one, click and drag it, move it over. And now frame 16 is literally 15% between 15 and 17, right? And then we could do another version. So this is a way to kind of play with pushing poses and, knowing what levers to pull that we've learned all this week between the line of action, silhouette, positive and negative, squash and stretch in the silhouette, shoulders and hips relationship, and all of these things can combine into pushing and appealing poses and creating appealing poses. So hopefully this gives you enough to go on for this week's challenge. I look forward to seeing what you create and play with in pushing these poses this week and kind of getting accurate versions and pushing, some poses. So let's see what you come up with. Thanks for watching. There's one handy method to analyzing and observing your silhouette, and that is kind of hacking the lighting inside the viewport. So right now it won't work because I actually have lights in my scene and I have a backdrop. For this effect to work, I need no backdrop and no lights in the scene. So what I can do is actually hide this environment group that has the background and the lights by hitting Control H with it selected in the outliner. And I still have my lights turned on here, this button, so you can see a clear silhouette as I move around, and you don't have the visual noise of the actual internal details of the character. Another way to use this, if you have a background in lights, is to isolate your character by using the Isolate Select button up here. And you can find lights, if you don't know where they're at, in your outline or in your scene. You can go Show Objects, and then you can find just the lights. So at least we can pinpoint what group the lights are in. Now if I hit Shift click the plus button here, that will expand everything in that hierarchy. In our case, there's nothing else there besides lights, so we can find those and then hide them as well. So now we can get to that point too. So there can be some finagling to get this to work, but typically early on in your shot, when you're doing the silhouette work, you probably don't have a very involved set and lights and all that kind of stuff. So this probably won't really be an issue when you're at this stage, because at that natural stage of analyzing your silhouette, you tend not to have all these things, all these details in yet. So that is one really helpful tip that you might want to use as you're evaluating your silhouettes. Just remember to turn off this checkbox for lights. Otherwise, it's going to hide everything else in your outliner. Thanks for watching. I want to quickly touch on the concept of speed and being fast. While that is very valued in a production setting, it's also important to be good. So you don't want to be fast and creating poor work. So we always want to make sure when we're considering speed that we're not sacrificing quality for speed. Now, it is important to be fast. That's just part of being in production, even though I've been told by some producers or managers that being fast is irrelevant, is the word I've heard. They tend to use that at times when you're asking for a raise, or it's convenient for them to marginalize and minimize someone being quick. So always take that with a grain of salt if you hear a manager or a producer or someone telling you that it's not that important to be fast, because I can tell you, if you are fast, you will stand out. And if you aren't, you will also stand out for being slow. But if you try to use that to your advantage, sometimes you'll also get into a difficult conversation with a manager where they have an attitude that it doesn't matter. So that's just the behind the scenes conversation, that maybe the real talk that people won't tell you of the reality of once you get into a job and you try to negotiate, if, let's say you are fast, they will try to minimize that typically. Maybe you'll have an amazing manager and they'll acknowledge your fast work and they'll reward you for it.
but more often than not, they try to find ways to minimize your contribution typically so that they don't have to give you a raise. So back to being fast. How do you be fast? Animation is basically a series of decisions. So the faster you can make the right decision, the faster you can make progress. If you are fast at making decisions, but they're constantly the wrong decision or you're guessing a lot, that's not going to be fast. You might be making those moves and decisions fast, but if it's the incorrect ones, then it doesn't matter how fast you're making them because you're taking a long time to find the right decision. So how do we find the right decision? How do we find it quickly? That's through practice. That's through what we're doing now. There's no secret. There's no shortcut to this. This takes work. And this is why it takes some time to get good at animation, because you have to put in the hours and the time. Sometimes people get there quicker than others and things click faster for some people than others. But the reality is everyone has to put in a certain amount of work so that they can get the muscle memory and train themselves to make better decisions quicker so that they can make more progress quickly. In practical terms, how do we approach our shot? How do we approach posing? In practical terms, when you're approaching a pose, you need to approach it in the same way that I've described, basically from the driver outwards. So typically we're starting with the COG, the thing that moves the most on the rig. It moves the whole rig. We're going to move that first. If you need to move your character into position somewhere in a scene, then you're going to move the root because that's going to move the entire character. You want to start from the big pieces outwards. People who sculpt, they don't start with the details first. They throw a big hunk of clay down and then they start pushing it around in big, broad strokes. Same thing if you're doing a painting, you get the big, broad strokes and you're doing a sky, put a bunch of blue down first. You're not in there painting clouds when you don't even have the blue sky in. So you want to make sure that you're posing in the same kind of way where you're using broad strokes, meaning you move the controllers that have the most control over the rig first. And then you work literally outwards from proximity of those outwards to the more detailed things, because basically the further away you go from there, everything gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? You have a ton of bones in your feet. You have a ton of bones in your fingers. If you have hair, maybe you have floppy hair. As you go away from the center of mass, things can get more complicated. So you want to deal with the big broad strokes first and then get into the details later. Now, we will cover the approach for working an entire shot later, the process of blocking plus, splining, polishing, all of those stages, whether they're pose to pose or layering or straight ahead animation, all that kind of strategy for an entire shot we'll talk about later. That's separate from the pose, because that's why we're chunking things down in this first week to single poses, because the reality is if we're not fast on a single pose, there's no sense in worrying about the whole strategy of how we approach an entire shot if we can't get one pose down quickly. So how I like to test and see where I'm at speed-wise, I like to set a timer on my watch. And I like to at least remind myself, hey, I've spent 5 minutes on this pose or 10 minutes or whatever it is, just to check in, because you can kind of get in a flow state and put the blinders on and 30 minutes go by and you realize you've only done one pose. So it can be nice to have something to remind you of how much time has passed so that it can trigger you to say, okay, stop messing around, stop playing around and experimenting with all these things, make a decision, move on. We can come back and adjust things if we need to, but we need to make progress and make a decision and move on. All right. And hopefully it's the right decision if we've been training ourselves for the right things to look for. And that goes to all the stuff we've already talked about in appeal, contrast, silhouette, hips and shoulders. All of these things combine into making the right decision. Okay. So by focusing on the pose this week, we can get down to the smallest element that we need to be effective animators, and so that we can work quickly. So this week, that's why we've been working on the single pose. Later, we can combine those single poses into an entire animation, but that's why we've been working on single poses so that we can get quick at the most fundamental thing that we need to do as animators, and that's set poses. So we know that animation is decision-making, good decision-making, and we work from basically the center of mass outwards and control, basically broad strokes to small strokes, big pieces to little pieces.
in the rig. And the other thing that I think people maybe get too preoccupied with are shortcuts and hotkeys and how they can, take off a half a millisecond on some operation that they're doing with their mouse or something. Those are the details, right? Speaking of broad strokes and details, those are the little details you can work out later and have your own little keyboard shortcuts or whatever you want. There's a few that are helpful, but it's not going to make or break how fast you are as an animator. You're going to make much more progress in speed by making better decisions and making them quickly and definitively instead of just exploring a million different options. And again, we do that with this framework that we've been learning about how do we build poses, how do we look at reference, and how do we translate that into our 3D character. So I just wanted to address that in this lesson because I get questions sometimes about how do I optimize my workflow? What's your process? And people seem to get into the weeds and the details before they have the big broad strokes down that are going to be the most effective. There's the 80-20 rule where if you can get the 20% right, it's going to get you 80% of the way there. And what I tend to see is that people are focusing on the minutia and the small, tiny little details when they don't have the big pieces fitting together yet. And that's why we're focusing on this stuff. And I'm trying to shepherd you away from worrying about the minutia and the tiny little things and the one little hotkey you heard about. That stuff doesn't really matter that much at this stage. Okay. So don't get too caught up in that. Let's focus on the poses. That's going to get you to be faster and have a higher quality quicker than worrying about some hotkey. Thanks for listening to this lesson. Hopefully that puts you at ease about where you are in your progression to become a faster, more quality animator and knowing what things to focus on and what not to. For this week, the challenges are all about posing. Read below exactly what we need to do. It is a bunch of poses that you can deliver as screenshots and the scene files as well, so that we can look at these poses from all 3 dimensions. You also have some gesture drawing to do. Nothing too complicated. Keep it simple. You don't have to be the best drawer in the world to be a 3D animator, luckily. So don't get too caught up in the details on gesture drawing. Keep it broad, keep it easy, flowing. Don't worry too much about that one. So you can take pictures if you want to use pencil and paper on that or pen and paper. So just take a picture with your phone and upload that as part of your assignment. You can zip everything into a single folder so everything is in one folder. Please include your name and what each of the drawings are based on the bullet points written out beneath me. This is the scene about push poses. I've put 2 of the rigs in here, which you will probably have to redirect when you open the scene. It will ask you to browse to where your version of this rig is. Wherever you've saved it on your machine, you'll have to click the browse button and then go find this rig file. And then it will know how to connect that reference. Same thing with these images. You can use the video down below on how to reconnect texture files so that it can find where these textures are, where you save them. Again, those are downloadable beneath me. So you have a bunch of pictures to choose from. I would not choose probably either one of these pictures that are in the folder for your other, don't use these for the gesture drawing or the balanced or the unbalanced poses, because these are going to be for this push poses example. I've made some basic poses here, and I want you to take these and push them further and correct some things that I've left out intentionally, because a lot of times in animation, you may have to pick up someone else's shot. And so you might be given a scene and you'll have to reinterpret what they've done and take it from there. Basically pick up the baton and keep running with it and fix whatever that someone else did and figure it out that way. It's very common in animation. When you're hired, you're typically not hired right at the start of a project. So sometimes you're hired right at the end, and you have to pick up other people's shot that have been working on it for years sometimes. And so you want to just start to get used to picking up someone else's stuff and taking it the rest of the way. So that's part of this assignment, this challenge this week. And again, you can save these files out with your name and the subject matter of what you're doing, the push poses, balanced, unbalanced, and then the gesture drawings, and then zip everything up into a single folder. I have instructions down below on how to do that. and then upload that this week for your challenges. Hey, so thanks for sending this over. Let's take a look at these poses. And I opened it with the front view. So I guess this is the camera view you were kind of matching to. But of course, the big thing with this is that ideally these poses work in 3 dimensions. So we'll take a look at that. So hopefully that came through in the assignment, is that, these should all work when I go into perspective mode as well. Because that's the challenge in 3D, is taking 2D, even if it's like reference video of yourself doing something or someone else, or, they're moving in 3-dimensional space. And we always have to recreate that to a 2-dimensional, usually render cam, unless you're working in video games. But anyway, before I get long-winded, let's just take a look at the poses here. Okay, so the first one is looks like a Highlands game thing. So I would say the main thing that stands out to me, without looking at this too much. So the best way to approach these poses is to think in terms of the relative relationship to other body parts, because those are things we can kind of use as landmarks to gauge where we're placing something relative to its neighboring limb or body part. So let me just open up this little tool so I can draw on the screen easily. So there's a couple of things. So the first thing I notice is, if you look at the shoulders here, they're pretty straight through, and you can also kind of sense the angle that they're on. So this seems like a much more shallow angle. This is almost like if I drew a straight up and down line. Oops. Actually, let me grab the line tool. So I'm holding down shift and drawing straight up and down. How many degrees off of vertical is that one versus how many degrees off vertical is this one? So it's a little bit off there. So we're losing that kind of momentum, energy that we're seeing in directionality by missing those angles. Overall, the pose is working. Like if I just, if you just blip this, it's like working. This is the nitty gritty. This is the nitty gritty kind of stuff. Then the other thing I was noticing is if the shoulder, the main thing is the shoulder stood out to me. Just kind of, the knee-jerk reaction of like the first thing that stood out. There's other things going on we can discuss, but just wanted to call that one out first. Because what I'm also seeing here is generally that, maybe the shoulder's in here, but this one feels like somehow the shoulder is like down here or something, because we have this arm going here and this arm going here. So there's kind of a disconnect where like here you can kind of feel the flow, how the silhouette of the arms kind of match. And here, there's this offset here where I'd have to go way up and then down or something. You know what I mean? This one feels like it should be more here-ish, and it could be that shoulder pad throwing you off. But I would raise that clavicle, or maybe you were trying to show the face here and this stuff was getting in the way. I would not worry about that in the future if that's the case. Control Alt Shift X. I made my own shortcuts. Control Alt Shift X. So I have sometimes a hard time remembering. Let that crash in. If this was a real character, if this was on a film, all this stuff would be simulated anyways, and so that wouldn't be our problem. Or you could get a rigger to come in and add a couple of things or something if it was really crucial moment. But so there's this disconnect. It feels like his shoulder's out of socket. Okay, and then we can kind of just move up the arm a little bit. It looks like this hand is pointing a little more in this direction than this direction, and this one feels like it's facing this way a little bit more than yours. The other thing that kind of stood out is the hand pose, the finger pose, because this is all kind of like, it's feeling a bit even.
like the gap between each finger is the same. And this pose, I know it's probably kind of small on the screen. Let me see if I can't just, I don't know why I have it so small right now. This pose, you can see he's got 3 grouped and then the pinky by itself. So we kind of have this asymmetry here, right? It's not each one's, there's actually no gaps except for the pinky. So that, makes it feel a bit more natural. And there's a bit more tension here when everything's, gap like this. I guess you could argue there's tension this way, because you have to try to keep your fingers apart like this that much. But in this moment, I think it'd be stronger to have them together clenched like he's flexing, to match that reference. Oh, I know I don't have that big because I was blocking my little pen tool thing. Okay, what else? So then there's I think it's the spine is what's keeping us from getting the angle that I'd like to see on the, I don't think the pen likes the movie player. Yeah, when I put my cursor over it, I can't draw. Why was that? I was just drawing on it. That's random. This has its own drawing thing, so let me just pull that up. Anyway, I'm looking at the angle of his eyes here, and this feels a bit more flat. It's another angle thing, so I would expect it to be more like this, the angle of his head. But what I was referring to the spine, because I feel like we're a bit more hunched over than this guy is. So this guy feels like his spine is, why is it letting me draw now? I guess because I drew first over here. Anyway, it's kind of like this, whereas this one feels like this is rounded off a bit. Maybe it's just the kilt that's throwing me on this. But I think having the hips not tucked as much here, on this rig, there's that little yellow control that looks like this, and it's the hip swing. And you could untuck the hips a little bit so that we kind of get more of this through here. And that might help the head posture too, that we feel like that the neck is more in line with the spine here. Anyway, so there's that. And I like how straight this arm is, feeling that weight of this thing. And I like that you use the bazooka just to impromptu convey the weight. Finger pose thing, same thing again. I think it would be like if I was to hand you a dumbbell, it'd be very you wouldn't hold the dumbbell like this. All your fingers would kind of squeeze together automatically just because they're taking the weight. And so unless it's, some kind of climbing specific or something's intentionally kind of separating your fingers, which I'm not getting from this thing right now. I think the fingers might be closer together. And I'm missing in this camera angle, which is what I'm viewing all this from first, is I'm missing this finger. I don't know what happened there, but or how that's, but typically they all kind of want to be, neighbors to each other in some way in that kind of an arc. Okay. And then, so back to I started this review talking about the relative nature. And so what I'm referring to is if we look at his head and then we draw a straight line down, how far away is his head from his first foot? And you could use something on his body, a head length. So we could be like, all right, he's 2 heads away from his foot. So he's leaned way over. And that makes sense on the kind of centrifugal force being generated from this twisting and spinning motion that he can be so far leaned over past his toes. But you can do the same thing here, and you can already probably tell where I'm going with this, that this head isn't as far over. We're about half the distance. All right, we're maybe one head length away from the front of the foot, so we're not leaned over as far, so we're losing some of that energy in this pose based on that. So that's kind of my overall kind of quick thoughts on this one. And we can jump out of the front view for a second and just take a gander. Let's see where that finger went. Oh, he's missing a finger on this rig. That's why. I totally forgot. Yeah, so this character is missing a finger. There are also controls on this thing. So where is it? Is it this? No, it's this. You can fix like his glove and stuff. I don't know if you saw that, but anyway. Okay. So let's figure out what's going on with it. Yeah, so you can already see the clavicle looks like it's way too low here. So this would be, let me just zero it out. I'm just curious what 0 is. Oh no, it's not. It's not big. Oh, you translated it. What's going on here? Let's find out. No, it's not anything. Weird. Is it just that this one's so high? Oh, you're moving these. Okay, so don't translate these. In general, joints can't, translate. Right. So like the way that this was rigged is based on a pivot point over here for the clavicle. You only ever want to rotate the clavicle. We don't want to be translating these. So do not translate those. All right. It'll give unnatural motion in general. Okay. That's a general thing. And for this different types of rigs, I wouldn't start there. Right. Like, yeah, I don't want to say don't ever do it, but like the pivot point and the natural locomotion of this clavicle is there for a reason, that it's pivoting from this point. And when you move it, there is no pivot point, and the entire thing is translating as opposed to rotating from a pivot. So it will look unnatural if this was animated. It would look like, I can't even do it because even trying it, obviously my stuff's rotating from the pivots of the clavicle. So I think this is probably what's caused such a difference in the shoulders, maybe. Yeah, this does look a little weird. Did you translate the shoulder? Maybe. No. I would raise this way up because we're thinking about this line through the body here and that kind of force that he would come with. So when we bring the clavicle up, we could bring the arm back down, but we want to have that starting point of the shoulder kind of going through the body and not have it be kind of disjointed like this. See how we lose that line of action through the shoulders here, kind of have this stair step thing going on. All right. Okay, yeah, so I'm looking at the 3D kind of version of this. Let me conceptualize. So I think we have another leaning kind of issue. I'm getting the sense that so this, what I think is happening is this foot is kicked more out, even more out, and the knees tucked more in, and he's leaning more to screen right. He's leaning more to this elbow here than I think you are. Just, I think it goes back to the leaning difference over the toes kind of a thing. I think the same thing's happening in the lateral kind of direction here. Yeah, it's hard to tell with the kilt whether the hips are doing, but yeah, I think we've done enough for that pose, but good work. Jump back to the front view to look at these other ones. And then we can jump to, I don't know if it's the fencing one. No, it's the handball one. Turn curves off. Just slide this over. Cool. So, yeah, good work. I mean, this one's pretty good. So, okay, cool. Let's go. So the first couple of things, if you look at this triangle, and then you compare this triangle, his hip is closer to the ground, right? If you look at the hypotenuse here, not that much. I think it'd be more over here. You know what I mean? Or more over here. Something like that. He's a lot more leaned over. And then the twist is good. I think we have maybe a knee difference here, where like your toe's pointing kind of this way and his is kind of pointing more here, and that brings the knee pointing. You can kind of see his knees pointing this way, and I think your knee's pointing right at us. So same thing with the toe. You know, if you brought it's the toe and the knee, if they were brought rounded up a little bit. And then this foot, you know, I know it's hard with these rigs, but you can tweak this stuff. But we have this kind of a thing going on here, whereas his feels much more of a straight line. So there are those. I'll show you these other foot controls. You know, you can get in there and just hand pose. You don't have to use all the foot rolly attributes on the main control. You can use the FK stuff that's already on the foot. I'll show you in a second. So there's that. I think the ball is a little bit more in here, and because I'm also looking at this distance here, and there's a combo situation here because I feel like his spine is a bit more rounded here, and yours is kind of flagging out this way. So I think you could tuck that spine in, crank his spine up more, which would close this gap, and then bring the ball in a little bit to have a bit more compression. Because what we're thinking about for the pose after this is going to be a really big extension. So, I mean, if anything, you'd want to maybe exaggerate the compression of this pose, because we know the next pose is going to be extension. We want that contrast. Just thinking, you know, in terms of animation-y stuff. The other thing, again, is this kind of flow through the arms and the shoulders. Like this pose is really nice. And you're really close to it. You're really close. There's a slight disagreement in the shoulder. And then if you look at this, is really rounded and yours has a bit more 90 degree. I know it's probably pretty hard with this rig to get any roundness, but I think it's a combo of, you know, if you look at this angle, like what this angle is versus what this angle is, his is much more obtuse, and yours is maybe at a 90 degrees or something. So, you know, even if the silhouette can't match that exactly, it's that feeling. And then the hands, you know, all the energy is here, and he's about to whip it, and this hand is much more relaxed. Where yours is kind of splayed. So maybe it was just a creative choice. Could work. But I think in terms of, in this instance of it being in the context of this pose, that it's going to be moving fast, if this was animated, we're going to just be dealing in shapes. And so anytime you have things kind of separated out like this, they're not going to read as clearly anyway. So I would probably find a way to collapse this down a little bit so that this reads as one shape. So when it's playing back, you know, if this was an actual animation, those fingers are basically creating negative space. And in motion, we're going to get like a bit of a strobe thing happening where it's like negative space finger, negative space finger, negative space finger as it's moving through. You know what I mean? As opposed to it being one solid chunk, it'll read a lot more clearly, and not be distracting, because I think it might, something like that could maybe pull our eye there when what we want to look at is like, this and looking this way and stuff, and not like a little flickery thing that would happen just from, you can maybe even see it in this, this versus this is a big difference to our eye. Okay. I think that's most everything, except for maybe I'm looking at the tilt of his head. His is a bit more back, and yours feels a bit more like forward. You know what I mean? Like his feels like his chin is tilting up, and yours feels like, and I don't think it's because of the scarf. Maybe that'd be hard to do anyway because of this costume, but it feels like if I'm thinking of the plane of the forehead and where that's pointing, his feels like it's pointing more this way, and yours feels like it's pointing this way. Do you know what I mean? So even if we're dealing with nonsense down here with like that we can't control because of the costume, I still feel like that. And if we look at this, I think we're not maybe tilted enough. I think you could tilt it, just slightly more. And cool. Let's look at it in 3 dimensions. Yeah. So what I'm getting. So I think it's a shoulder thing again, where this could maybe be more. This feels more in line with the front of his chest. You know what I mean? Like this feels like it's along the same plane, whereas this feels like it's set back, like we're kind of going back. So I think you could bring this forward, and if any, because the main thing I'm fighting with here is that we kind of have this thing going on, and this feels like it's much more straight through. I get this is coming back here, but it's mainly this one. If the clavicle was brought forward and brought this whole thing forward, it would maybe feel more in line with the chest, that plane of the chest, and would flow through here, as opposed to kind of being behind the chest and then we got to come out and then around. You know what I mean? As a line of action through the body. Okay, the main thing what I'm trying to articulate in my mind is his foot. And this photo feels like it's behind his head, and this is all in line with that foot. Do you know what I mean? Like I think the foot almost should be back here, and it because every right now everything feels like it's in line. It's in the same line, and this feels like this foot's over here. This foot is more out in front, and this hand is in front of this foot, so that would put this hand, which would go in line with the note earlier about the shoulder and the chest being in the same plane. That if the ball's in front of this foot either needs to go and maybe needs to go further back here, and then that hand needs to come more forward here and get more twist in the body, and the chest is facing maybe too. Yeah, I think it's favoring too much this way. And then, maybe the head's more over here. The head's kind of in line with that, but just getting so that everything's not in a line there, because he's so leaned over. He's using this other foot to balance this offset and Z depth space. These two. Anyway, yeah, something to think about. Just my take on it. Cool. Trying to think of anything else. I think that's good. Cool. Next one. Jump into the front view again. I like that you made. I'm impressed you made the fencing thing. Let me know if you modeled that thing. I like you went to those links for that. Okay. So we're looking at the right one. Let's scoot this over, maybe. So I meant to show you the feet on that other one. Sorry. One sec. Let's jump back. So when we were looking at that one, his foot is this on the ground. Oh, you did it a little bit. All right, cool. I think you could just go further with it even. It's not this one, is it? Yeah. Oh, other one. Yeah. So even if we come into the front view to break up that ankle situation and have that coming more through, and we don't want to break everything at the toes as much. Just for speed's sake, I'm going to translate this, but I wouldn't recommend that. He's kind of more up on here, and that would maybe let us bring this back some here. Well, not that one. You know what I mean? So we kind of get rid of that ankle situation, and then we can maybe move the toe or here. Yeah, there's a little weird bulge there, but I think that's just, you would be able to fix that from what I can tell. So you can move this around weird. Yeah. Is that translated? Sorry, just exploring ideas here. But you know what I mean? And you kind of get this straight line through here as opposed to, let's see if I can do it enough times. Here we kind of had this heel kicking out here. All right. Okay. Anyway, back to this one. Okay. I think this is probably a stronger pose. I'm wondering if you did this pose last, if it's the third one. It feels like maybe you kind of got into a rhythm here on this one. It's kind of hard to see what this back foot's doing. I forget how to zoom in on this thing. Here we go. What's the back foot doing? It almost feels like it's cranked up there. That black on black isn't very helpful for us, but like it feels like this is rounded here, and this is flat. So it's hard to tell, but it looks like there's a bit, you know what I mean? Like this little gap here, like the foot's coming in and then it's coming up here. It feels like maybe. But everything else is feeling pretty good. It feels like this shoulder's out a little too far. And I don't know if that's because, I don't know why that is, but I don't know if his chest is facing too far, rotated too far that way or something. And maybe it's just the fact that I don't know his head. If you look at his head relative to like where his shoulder is versus this guy's, granted his actual face is probably back here somewhere, but it's like right over the shoulder, and we have that's maybe not the case as much, that his head is much further back. So it could be a twist in the spine issue. If you rotated the spine back in depth to camera here, that would force the shoulder back if you twisted the spine back in. My fingers look good. I think you could push it a bit. These look fully straight, and you kind of have this bent in here, like it's a bit more relaxed. And this feels like very tense to me. All these straight lines, which you got on that one, nice, straight, straight, straight. But I think in these, they're a bit too relaxed for the tense moment. And I like, he's fencing with the hand that is missing a finger, which I totally forgot about this rig. It's funny. Those glove things I showed you would probably help with this angle. It feels a bit intense. Also rotating, I think the palm is facing the camera too much here. If you rotated it back, you could possibly soften this angle a bit through here by rotating the palm back this way. I think it would maybe help that angle as well. Everything else is feeling pretty good. It's so hard because the costume is kind of so different. Part of me wants to say the hips are a bit too tucked here, but it could just be the costume. Hard to say here. Yeah, and then I think it's this shoulder situation and this one. If you look at the angle, you know what I mean, from the shoulder to the elbow, and then the angle from here to here, like. This is not a good color. This angle, let me draw like 90 degrees just to figure out what the hypotenuse kind of angle is. And then we drew a hypotenuse for this. And then we draw a little 90 degree to figure out, this is much more steep and this is much more shallow. So you can think in terms of angles to help determine where you're putting stuff. And then in relation to the rest of the body, this is, where's that relative to his chest? This guy's chest, like if I had to guess where this guy's nipple is, it's right here. This guy's nipple is like maybe here. Do you know what I mean? So his hand is in line with that. And this one's up high and that angle. So you could bring it down, tuck it in more, then it'd be a bit more in line there. I'll maybe get just a subtle toe roll here, maybe just to break up this straight line here. I think it's so hard with these black shoes, but I think there's maybe a very subtle one here, breaking at the ball. That's how you get that and just kind of have it something slightly so it's not so straight there, but just a tiny, tiny thing. Let's look in 3D. Yeah, to me, his head here feels more close to this knee if I'm looking straight down. You know what I mean? That these two would be closer together. And that could be a combination of the spine, and I think it's a lot of pull vector too. This knee feels like it's too far out. This one's tucked in. You can feel the compression in with the inside of his thigh here almost with whatever this guard thing is that he wears. And this feels like it's turned out maybe a bit too much. So I would pull this in. You know what I mean? That's going to bring that over the head more. Just fix this. Bring that in. That. Maybe untuck the hips a little bit. Let's see what that's doing. Round out the toe. That's not the right one. Is it this one? Whatever we can do the opposite just to and then these things. And so the palm, what did I say? The palm was too close to straight to camera, like flat, so we could rotate this up. It feels like it's kind of more Voldemort-y, like whatever he says. And then these. Oh, is that not bound to anything? That one might be broken. Wait. Oh, I need to fix that. It's constrained to the wrong thing. It's constrained to the joint instead of the joint being constrained to it. You can see from the blue here. So I got to fix that in that rig. But anyway, you get the idea. If that wasn't broken, you could kind of smooth out this angle by just kind of favoring forearm. Yeah, why is this shoulder out so far? Did you translate these? Yeah, this is a problem. 8. Whoa, dude. Translating by 8. Yeah, I think that's the theme here. You don't want to be translating those. That is oddly still far out there. Why is this armpit so big? Is it what's happening in the spine here? Okay, I think I see the problem. You've really cranked this one, and then you've left these other ones, right? So we got 12 and Z. So 14 versus 38. So the chest is cranking twice as much as here. And so we're not getting a smooth transition when those are so different. And I think that tuck issue of the hips is because this is cranked in so much. I'm just out of curiosity. 1, 2, 0. Whoops. 0 these out. Let me turn the reference back on. I just want to move these together. Oh, because that chest thing is wonky, huh? That's probably why you did it. There. What I'd probably do is just do this one by itself and then do these two together. You know what I mean? But yeah, I think that note on the armpit thing, it's just weird that's so. Did you translate the shoulder? No. Weird. It's weird that there's so much armpit action there. I would almost do this. If I was going to translate it in any direction, it'd be to like get it back in the body. That's such a weird, could be a weight issue too with the rig, but where is it cranked? No, okay. That. Let me zero this out. I'm just curious. No. X. Oh, this is a weighting issue here. This whole bicep should be moving. Okay, I can't lay claim to that because the weights are coming from Unreal, but the bicep should totally be rotating with that. That's weird. Yeah. Anyway, for what you've got here in the rig, you did your best. I think that's fine. I think just in a perfect world, those are the notes I'd be giving. Yeah, that's weird. I don't know. I didn't catch that when I was making the control rig for the skeleton that I just adopted from Unreal. I'm totally scapegoating the fact that I got that skeleton and the weights from Unreal. That's just weird though. Why wouldn't it? You know what it is? Is these Unreal skeletons have twist joints bound to them, and I'm wondering if that would work when you brought it back into Unreal. Just thinking out loud. Anyway, that Yeah, I'm curious about that. Anyway, for another time. So yeah, overall, I think the poses went well. I like what you did. I like the choices in poses. These dynamic poses are cool. Yeah, I think the overall kind of thoughts and messages are that might be helpful going forward is using the relative position of body parts to other body parts to try to figure out those and think in terms of angles and the relationship of body parts to other body parts and the shoulders and that line of action through the arms and the shoulders and the clavicles and not translating the clavicles to start with. I would say start with rotating them before you translate them if you're needing to cheat, because technically you're like breaking their bones to be able to translate that. So on a rig like this, it's a bit more realistic. You wouldn't want to be the first option to choose to cheat the rig. And cheat is used not pejoratively in animation, so I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way. You do need to cheat stuff sometimes, but that just wouldn't be my first option for those clavicles. So I would keep with rotating those. And I know it's probably another reason why I'm thinking you probably did it is because it's FK and you would have to repose the arms before, like if you pose these arms out first and you're like, oh, I want the shoulder higher, and then it's totally going to mess up the position of your arm. Two options are A, pose the clavicles first, so then you don't run into that. And then B is to switch to IK. So if you are in IK, and we had this wherever, we can pose the shoulder however we want, and it's not going to move the hand position. So that's the other option. Cool. Thanks for sharing this and good work. Look forward to seeing the next stuff. Talk to you later. Bye. Congrats on finishing this masterclass in posing. Again, this is the first week of a 12-week long course at animatorsjourney.com. So I hope to see you there. Please leave me a final thumbs up and like below and comment what you got out of this course and if you want to see more like it. If you want to see other courses right now on YouTube, check out the links somewhere around me. Thanks for watching, and I hope you subscribe.